You fool! Warren is dead. From the Library of Rillier, 5 Cthulhu Mythos stories. The Scourge of B'Moth by Bertram Russell. 1. The Fog. The first inkling that I had of the gigantic abomination that was soon to smother the world with its saprophytic obscenity was obtained almost by accident. My friend, Dr. Prendergast, a gentleman eminent in his own particular branch of medicine, which included all sorts of brain specializations, operations, trephining, and so on, called me personally by telephone from his own residence late one night. It struck me as surprising that he should not have had his secretary or nurse call me during office hours. I was not in error when I thought his mission an urgent one. "Randall," he said to me, "I've never seen the like of this in all my years of experience, and I'm pretty sure you never did in yours either." "A mental case?" I asked with quickening interest. "Yes, and more. It's got me almost beaten to a standstill. I confess I'm pretty nearly stumped. I've gone over him thoroughly, x-rayed him and so on, but still I can't find any evidence whatever of organic disturbance." "Well, can't it be a functional neurosis?" I asked in some surprise. "If it is, I never saw another like it. The fellow seems to be actually possessed. He acts without knowing why he does so. I've given him a rough psychoanalysis, but it reveals nothing more than the repressions and inhibitions that every average person has. His unconscious contents show absolute ignorance of the awful obsession by which his waking hours are beset." "There must be a reason for it," I said. "If a man has an obsession, there are unconscious associations to exercise it with. It can only be the symbol for something else." "The symbol for something else. You're right there. But if I can't find out what this something else really is, and pretty soon at that, this patient is going to join his master before long." "His master?" I queried, surprised at what I thought to be a biblical allusion by Prendergast. "Yes, whoever that is. He talks about nothing else. This master represents the thing that is dominating him, stretching out its slimy tentacles from the darkest depths of unfathomable abysses to strangle the desire to live within him. He says now that he is eager to die, and you don't need me to tell you what that means in the neurotic." "I'll come over immediately," I said. "German-American Hospital, Ward 3, Psychiatric," he said, giving me the final instructions. I hurriedly donned my clothes. I had been reading Goethe in a dressing gown before retiring, and unlocking the garage, I started the coupe. Soon I was on my way to the hospital, where my friend had arranged to meet me. The night was exceptionally dark, and a thin, clammy drizzle had commenced to fall. Not a cold rain, but a viscid, penetrating darkness like the breath of some Stygian fury. The car was quite closed, yet I felt the clammy thrill of it inside. I even noticed that the instrument board was covered with drops of fluid, and the wheel became wet and unruly under my touch. I almost allowed it to slip out of my hands as the car rounded a sharp curve. I jammed the brakes on. The wheel skidded on the slithery ground. I had been just in time to prevent the coupe from careening over the edge, where a dark abyss fell away from the road, as if a giant had scooped a track through the heart of the hills. A cold perspiration broke out all over me. I could hardly drive. My hair tingled at the roots, for it had seemed to me at that moment that Hands other than my own had wrenched that wheel from mine in a demonic lust of murderous intent. Try as I would, I could not throw off the hideous thought that a nameless fetidity had me in its control at that moment, and was even now within the car, bent upon my distraction. Was I, a psychiatrist of years' standing, versed in all the processes that produce madness in the human brain, skilled in treatment of those within its devouring maw? Was I falling headlong, powerless to help myself into the awful depths of lunacy? I fought the very suggestion, but to little avail. The dark night, the wild and mountainous nature of the country, where the hospital had been erected for the sake of quietness and seclusion, combined to produce a feeling of unknown forces, malignant in their fury toward man and the sons of man, that I could not dismiss. But more than all was the nauseating, overpowering effect of that clammy fog, like a breath of evil that rode with me, enveloping me in its chill blast. I laughed aloud at the notion of a presence other than my own in the car, and the laugh, muffled by the turgid breath that surrounded me, echoed in weird accents from the rear of the car. My voice had sounded strange, like the insincere laugh of an actor who is not interested in his role. I even turned to the rear of the coupe, as if expecting to see the presence there, but my darting eyes revealed nothing. This madness must cease, I told myself, as I turned on the electric warmer inside the car. It may have been the comforting heat that this produced, or it may have been an unconscious assurance that the laws of nature still continue to function. My turning the switch had proved this. I did not know what was the true cause, but as the heat within the car increased, my spirits warmed too, and I found myself driving with my accustomed care and utterly without the meaningless fears that had overwhelmed me so few minutes ago, but so many ages since, as it seemed to me then. The air inside the car was clear now. The drops of moisture had disappeared from the instrument board, and my hand grasped the steering wheel with its accustomed firmness. But it was becoming uncomfortably hot. Still, I hesitated to switch off the heater, arrested by I know not what unknown fear. It may have been a warning from that great unknown that we are now only dimly beginning to understand. I cannot say, but at last I switched off the heater. As the air cooled, my spirits cooled too. I felt the same senseless dread stealing over me, and I watched with intense anxiety for the reappearance of those drops of moisture on the dashboard. Seeming to materialize from nothingness, they came. The air within the car thickened, and again caressed me with its voluptuous and sickly folds. As the lights of the hospital appeared upon the crest of a ridge ahead of me, I began to tell myself that I had to turn on the heater once more. But my will was not equal to the act. I drove on in a kind of dream, blithely careless of anything in the world. The steering wheel responded easily to my touch. It even seemed to spring from under my hand as I swerved around treacherous corners, where chasms thousands of feet deep yawned below, missing the edge by a scant few inches. I drove on heedless in the dense opacity. I could see nothing now, but the wheel seemed to have a magic of its own. I felt the car bumping and undulating like a roller coaster. My head crashed against the roof. The springs bent with an ominous crack. I felt the wheels slithering sideways as though someone were pulling them from their course, and finally, with a terrific crash, the coupe turned over and would have capsized completely if the pillars that marked the entrance to the hospital had not partly prevented it from falling. Dr. Prendergast and two of his associates opened the door and dragged me out, half-dazed, into the night. "What's wrong, Randall?" said Prendergast anxiously. I stood there, stupidly, hardly knowing what answer to make. "We've been watching you for some time. We saw your lights 5 miles away. You've been driving like a man in a dream. Look, you've ruined half the flower beds in the hospital grounds." I turned and saw the tracks of the car cut deep into the lawns and flower beds before me. I had left the driveway and travelled across the hills and valleys of the landscape garden. A chill dread came over me. I could see the tracks of the car clear out into the road beyond. I could even see the headlights of another car travelling along the same road that I had come, miles away. In the soft air there was no moisture. Above, the stars twinkled along their age-old courses. The fog had lifted. With a new fear clutching at my heart's vitals, I spoke to them. The fog, the rain, it made it impossible for me to see. I couldn't find the road half of the time. I never saw such a night. Fog? Rain? There's been no fog and no rain. Why, we could see your headlights for miles. The night is as clear as a crystal. But there was fog, right up to a minute ago. The car was wet with it, I tell you. As I spoke, I reached my hand to the windshield, intending to prove my assertion. In amazement, I looked at it. There was no trace of moisture, none at all. I stooped to the grass and buried my hand in it. There was no rain upon it. It was even a little dried up, and I could see it had not been watered for some time. Again I pierced the night. There was not a cloud in the air anywhere, not a bank of fog between the hospital and the city. "What you need is a stimulant. Come inside, and I'll give you one," said Dr. Prendergast, taking me cautiously by the arm. Fearful for my own sanity, I stumblingly entered the hospital. As I took one last look around, I thought I saw a thin wisp of sickly vapour curling around the green lawn before me, like a wraith of yellow venom. And while my distraught nerves tingled in every fibre, there came to me the muffled echo of a mocking laugh. Half walking, half sliding, I was taken into the hospital. 2. The Call of B'Moth. "Feel better?" asked Dr. Prendergast, when I had gulped the stimulant that he had handed to me. In the cheerful air of the doctor's private office, I felt my fears to be of the flimsiest. I even felt constrained to laugh aloud at them. But the memory of that ride was not so easily effaced. However, I made light of my experience, saying that I had had but little sleep, and night driving did not agree with me. Dr. Prendergast gave me a curious look from his slanted eyes, but said nothing. We left the office, and taking the elevator, were soon in Ward 3, the ward where the mental cases were confined. A nurse met us with a chart in her hands. "How is the patient?" asked my colleague, with more than usual interest. "Still delirious, doctor," answered the trim little nurse. "We shall take a look at him," he remarked, walking toward a cot in a far corner of the room. "There he is," he added to me. Before us lay a pallid-looking figure. His black hair was tousled, as though he had been tearing at it with his fingers. His eyes were surrounded by deep, hollow circles that made him look like a grim precursor of death itself. He was talking inarticulately and holding a disjointed conversation with some imaginary creature that he alone saw. As I sat beside him, he burst into a frenzied laugh. Lifting his emaciated hand toward me, he pointed a skinny finger into my face. "Ha! Here's another one to rob the master. You came too late. The master saw to that." "Quiet yourself," said Dr. Prendergast in a soothing voice. "You are going to get well, but you must not excite yourself in this fashion." "Going to get well? Oh, no, I'm not. The master saw to that. I'm going soon, very soon. I'm going to join the master. Deep down, where he waits for the faithful. That's where I'm going. Why should I want to live? Why should I wait around when there is work to be done?" "What sort of work?" I inquired, hoping to relieve the compression within him by allowing him to talk. "The work of the jungle. The work of the deep, that's what must be done. The time approaches. Millions and millions will help, and I shall soon be there. You came too late. The master saw to that. On the storm he rides. His breath is the breath of the fog. In the rain he comes to the earth. He stayed you tonight, eh? Didn't he? In spite of myself, I was troubled. Who was this master who rode on the wings of the storm, and whose breath was the fog? I asked myself how this lunatic in his ravings knew of my experience that night. He was gasping for breath. His efforts had exerted him unduly, and apparently he was about to expire. The nurse brought a glass of water, which he gulped greedily. "Water," he said. "Oceans of it. That's what the master likes. That's the way to reach him. Into the caves where the blue light flames, it goes down, down, beneath the bodies of dead men, deep, deep. The master, B'Moth, master, I come." His head fell back upon the pillow, and with a rapt expression in his eyes, he died. I stood perplexed. This could be no ordinary case of hallucination. The man had seemed, as Dr. Prendergast said, bewitched, possessed. I left the cot in company with my friend. Suddenly, he clutched my arm feverishly. "Look!" he cried. "Look!" I turned in the direction in which he was pointing. The glass of water was still clutched in the patient's hand. The fluid glowed with a lambent bluish radiance. It flitted across the features of the dead man, which became greenish under its influence. His lips twisted into a snarl under the light, and the sharp fangs of his long canine teeth pricked through his closed mouth. And the water in the glass was bubbling as though it boiled. And there before my eyes the fluid slowly fell, until the glass was empty of all, save the bluish glow that surrounded it, and not only it, but the bed, the linen, the dead man, and ourselves. 3. The Unknown. The pressure of my professional duties served to drive the matter from my attention for several days, but it was rudely brought to my mind in a manner as strange as can well be conceived. I had been carelessly scanning the newspaper when my eyes were arrested and riveted by a small and apparently unimportant notice that was sandwiched in between the account of a big alimony case and the raid upon some bootleggers. Had the editor known the full import of his copy, he would have blazoned the thing in block type and put out a special edition of his sheet. But he did not, any more than did I myself at that time, suspect that soon there was to arise from the deeps a menace whose cancerous sores were destined to spread their purulent way into the very heart of civilization itself. I quote the notice verbatim. Arica, Peru, May 8. A strange case was brought to the attention of police here today. Alonso Sagardus, a man of West Indian extraction, was hailed before Justice Cordero on a charge of attempted suicide. He was seen to dive into the ocean near Point Lucasta by Captain Jenks, the lookout at the Marine Exchange Station there. Jenks says he rushed to the assistance of the man, thinking he had intended to go swimming and did not know of the treacherous undertow at the point. When he arrived, however, he saw at a glance that it was a case of attempted suicide, for Sagardus could not swim, and was merely floundering around helplessly in the depths. Captain Jenks promptly dived into the water at the place known to sightseers as Devil's Cauldron, and after a frantic struggle with the maelstrom, during which the West Indian did his best to drown the two of them, was able to rescue the man. Instead of thanks, however, Sagardus struck Jenks brutally upon the face, crying, "The curse of B'Moth upon you! It was the call of the master. What right have you to interfere? I went to join B'Moth, and now you have dragged me back again. When the time comes, you shall suffer." The incident has aroused widespread local interest, because it is said that the Devil's Cauldron upon foggy days is the meeting place of spirits of the deep. Legend has it that upon such days and during the rainy season, the monster of the pool arises from the deep water to claim his own. Obviously, the distorted mind of the superstitious man thought he had been called by the spirit of the cauldron. It is interesting to note that a thick haze commenced to overcloud the pool after Sagardus had been rescued. Until this time, the sun had been shining with great brilliance. There is much excitement among the native population here, and talk is common that the rescue bodes no good for the white man. Serious disturbances have arisen in several inland villages, and police and military have united forces to protect the white population, against whom the attacks seem chiefly to have been directed. Apparently, the incident had only obtained recognition in the press because of the legends which were connected with the Devil's Cauldron, and which were thought to be of interest to the outside world, and because of the attempted uprisings against the white people. But to me, the insertion of that single and apparently incomplete word gave a sinister and terrible inflection to the whole paragraph. Who or what was B'Moth? It must be the same master to whom the dying man had appealed in the German-American hospital, and there was no shadow of doubt that it was a duplication of the same occurrence, unconnected with it, except by the subtle influence of the B'Moth. I felt my hair begin to tingle when I read the news item again and came to note about the fog that overlay the pool after the man had uttered his curse. This was too close a similarity to admit of any such explanation as mere coincidence. As a psychiatrist, it interested me greatly, and I even began to feel in some obscure way that it was my duty to investigate the whole business. Perhaps, and far-fetched as the idea may seem, I thought of it in all seriousness. Perhaps the very sanity of the world was at stake. As I laid the paper aside and prepared to drive to my office, I felt again the oppressive weight of that unspeakable thing that I was slowly coming to dread, so that I could not drive alone in fog or through a rainstorm, though I dared tell no one of this phobia. I felt, good God, how I felt, the weight of that slimy pollution. I seemed to be drawn unresistingly into the slavering maw of this foul corruption from hell. I stood transfixed, my teeth chattering, unable to lift a hand, watching the place where I felt absolutely certain the thing was. And then, into my jangled consciousness came the imperative ringing of the telephone bell. I moved slowly toward the instrument, my eyes fixed irresistibly upon the other side of the room. Mechanically, I lifted the receiver. A voice came as though from a great distance. "Is that Dr. Randall? Please come across to the German-American hospital immediately. Dr. Prendergast has gone insane." 4. Madness. When I arrived at the hospital where my friend was being treated, the condition of my mind was far from equable. That the same calamity which I dreaded had actually befallen my friend came as no slight shock. But I resolutely strove to compose myself as I entered the building. If my suspicions were correct, there was work to be done, hard work and plenty of it, if this foul thing was to be foiled in its malign purposes. I found Dr. Prendergast in a comfortable private room, the best in the place. He was sleeping quietly when I entered, but before I had been there more than a few minutes, he awoke, and looking at me, shook hands cordially. He did not have the appearance of a lunatic at that time. He began to speak in a natural, softly modulated voice. "Randall, there's something strange and uncanny about this business. Ever since that affair when I had to call you into consultation, I've had an odd feeling that all is not well. I've actually been harassed by morbid phobias, if that's what they are. I never dreamed of a psychosis coming to me. The more I think about the matter, the more I have come to believe that you and I are marked out as martyrs to the cause, though why or how I cannot even begin to understand. You seem all right now, and certainly you never gave me the impression of being neurotic. That's just it. I ought to be the very last person to lose his mind, but though I'm as sane as it is possible for a man to be at this time, in a few minutes that thing may have me in its clutch, and I shall be a raving lunatic. It's funny, Randall, to be able to analyze your own particular form of lunacy, if such it is. I can remember quite well what happened to me last night. It is much more real than the usual dream associations, and I dread its return more profoundly because of this. If this is lunacy, it is a form never before seen, but I don't think it is lunacy at all. Tell me about it, I urged. Perhaps two minds can do what one cannot. There's not much to tell. I'd been reading Freud until a late hour last night, his last book, you know. Thoughts that were assuredly not born of earth came to me. I began to feel an immense distaste for life. The life that we live today, I mean. I thought of the days of the jungle, and those primordial memories that lie dormant within every man came back to me. The artificiality of the world, with its commercial systems, its codes of conduct, its gigantic material things, that after all have done little else besides making life harder to live and shorter. All these appeared as the flimsiest futility. It seemed to me that man was not made to live in this fashion. I thought that the giant primeval forest with its fierce combat of man against man and beast against beast was the fitting habitat of life. I thought of those monsters of the deep, glimpsed occasionally by passing vessels, huge beyond the conception of man. Once life had been lived altogether on a gigantic scale like that. I felt, I can't say just why, a deep kinship, an affinity with those bloated colossi of the sea, the carrion that feed upon the bodies of the dead. They seemed to me to represent the farthest step that could be taken in a retrogressive direction, back from civilization, you see, back from the painfully acquired things that we count so valuable. And here is the strange part. It seemed to me that this thought did not come wholly from myself. It was almost as if something had whispered into my ear that foul abomination of regression. I felt that at the same moment, not I alone, but thousands and thousands, rather millions, were dreaming of the time when the cycle should have been completed. We always learned that things are cyclical, you know. Rome rose, was great, fell. So on with the other civilizations, all of them. So undoubtedly will be our own great civilization. It will be the mythical end of the world that seers have predicted for centuries. There will be no starry cataclysm, but a return of all life to the jungle. Competent authorities state that if something is not done to stop this approaching catastrophe, we shall be literally eaten alive by insects, ants, for instance. There seems to be plenty of scientific basis for this suggestion. But who has thought of the awful possibilities that may arise if those unknown creatures, bloated to foul enormity, shall in concerted array overrun the civilized world? It's an awful thought, but there's no foundation for it, I said comfortingly, for even in his sane moments my friend seemed to evidence a wildness not quite normal. I'm not so sure that there's no basis for it. I've had a feeling lately that there is a tremendous movement underway that has as its sole object the overthrow of civilization and re-establishment of the life of the jungle. And here's what appears to be the reason for selecting us. We can exercise an enormous control over the minds of men. You agree? This unspeakable thing has seized upon us, is trying to enmesh us in its filthy net, to enlist us in the cause, because with the influence that we can exert, we should be enormously valuable. Do you follow? We are to be apostles of this rotten creed. What an appalling idea. I'd rather be dead, I said with a shudder. Dead? Who knows what might happen to you then? You might join the master. You too, I cried. A spasm of horrible fear crossed my friend's face as the full import of his words bore in upon him. His muscles were twisted in an agony of internal strife, as he fought the insidious influence that was striving to warp the straightness of that magnificent brain. They haven't got me yet, Randall, but they're after me. I'll fight them. I pray that my lucid intervals may be frequent enough to enable me to unravel this foul mystery. Good God! I'm in a cold sweat all over. Tremors. I started across the room to the table, and pouring a glass of water, handed it to my friend. He shuddered convulsively, and recoiled from it as from a living horror. Away! He shouted. Take that contagion away! It's after me! It's alive! I won't drink it! It means madness! With a frantic effort, he dashed the glass and its contents upon the floor. I stared at my friend, aghast. Suddenly a thought came to me, a recollection of that night when a certain glass of water had glowed with iridescent fire, when, through the baneful influence of the fog, my own mind had skirted the borderland of lunacy. I began to understand. My colleague was calming himself again. Presently, he spoke. It's going to be a fight for me, he said, but I'll battle to the last gasp. Your part will be to watch and, if possible, learn more of this awful thing that menaces the sanity of the world. There must be some way to destroy it. How shall I start? I muttered in puzzled bewilderment. I had only the slightest of clues to work upon. The newspaper cutting did little more than confirm what I already suspected. Your key is the word of the master, B'Moth. Don't forget, B'Moth. What it means I can't say, but the word has been ringing in my ears for days. That's the master. That's the name of this cankerous rottenness that you must destroy. Five. A clue from the past. I left the hospital in a daze. How was I to destroy this thing? I was already half in its clutches. I could do little but flounder in the dark. If, as Dr. Prendergast and that dead man had asserted, there were millions of followers, they kept their doings secret. B'Moth. The word was like a voice from another world, without meaning. I thought and thought in an agony of apprehension. I knew not where to turn for information. I spent hours in my library, greatly to the detriment of my practice. I exhausted most of the books of mythology and of anthropology, but still I could find nothing that seemed to have any bearing upon the matter. One day, when I was going through an ancient volume of Cain's Magic and the Black Arts, bound with a heavy bronze clasp and closed with lock and key, I came upon the following. There be many who revere the Devourer, though few have seen the full stature of this great power. It is a vision fraught with eldritch horror, and much sought by wizards of early times. One Johannes of Magdeburg, wise in the lore of the ages, hath met success greatly in his efforts. He asserteth that the Devourer liveth in the deep, and is not to be reached by any means, yet he hath been able to feel his breath and know his will. The secret is in a vaporous effluvium, for the Devourer hath power to manifest himself where there is moisture. His breath is the fog and the rain. Wherefore many do account water the elemental, and do worship it in divers ways. This Johannes hath told in his book of medicine how he did conjure from a heavy vapour in his efforts the very essence itself, upon occasion. The phosphorus light of dead things did swell into a great brightness and fill the chamber, and withal came the spirit of the Devourer. And Johannes hath learned that he liveth in the deepest ocean, where he awaiteth only a time auspicious for his return to earth. Many there be who joyfully believe the time approacheth, yet Johannes saith that many centuries shall pass, ere the master returneth to claim his own. Much astonishment hath one remark which he made produced. He saith that the devourer is a familiar of every man and every woman. He liveth eternally in the inner man. He reacheth forth from the deep, and the inner man doth hear. All-seeing is his eye, all-hearing his ear. None can destroy him, for he is intrinsic in all men. In times of evil and lust, of war and strife, of man against man and brother against brother, the devourer liveth lustily in men. His ways are the ways of the deep. There be saints and mystics who believe they have exorcised the devourer, but in them also he liveth. In the deeps of the waters and in the souls of men he sleepeth, and one day will awaken to take his own. I finished the ancient manuscript with a start. Though the thing was called by another name, I could not doubt that the reference was to the same. I sought eagerly for the book of medicine that had been written by Johannes of Magdeburg, and after hunting all day, I at last unearthed a copy in an antique shop. It was torn and badly discoloured, the writing in Latin, and in many places hard to decipher, but I found something of great interest to me. Johannes, after describing his attempts to communicate with the devourer, told of his success. He had learned the secret from a philosopher of a still earlier day. I quote, translating as well as I am able. Being of a mind to discover the ultimate, I sought diligently into the works of historians and wise men of all ages. In my studies, I chanced upon a manuscript written by one Joachim of Caen. He had gathered a wealth of lore from men of every clime. He said the name of the devourer was Behemoth, which indeed is translated into he who devours the souls of men. This monster is of great antiquity, and was well perceived by the ancients. In the Hebrew Bible he is mentioned. The seer Job makes much in speaking of him. All men are agreed that his size is as great beyond a man's as a man is great beyond the stature of a toad. He has the power to reproduce forever, and after the flood times he was driven into the ocean, where he lives among the dead in the caves of crawling things. But the power of his thoughts is over all men. He has divers powers of manifestation. Through water and through mist is he felt, and his thoughts are the thoughts of the toad and the snake, wherefore these reptiles are accounted sacred by many. There is but one spell that can be cast to conjure him back to the ocean, and the parts of it. I dropped the manuscript with disappointment. In my extremity I was prepared to work any spell if it would, as Johannes said, be successful in exorcising this dread thing, and the careless handling of the ages had torn from the manuscript the page where the spell was formulated. But now at least I had a clue to the thing. I snatched up a complete Bible, and read avidly all the references to the behemoth in the Old Testament and Apocrypha. I also consulted other works described as Old Testament Apocrypha, and found more references. There were many, but they were all agreed upon the devouring quality of the destroyer, and all affirmed that he would some day return from the depths to claim his own. Winslow's encyclopedia, which I consulted last, placed as a footnote to an earlier article a paragraph stating that in many countries an organized worship of the behemoth was practiced under various disguises, and that the cult was more prevalent near the equator and among savage peoples. The learned historian suggested that the animal might be a hippopotamus. How little did he know of the power about which he wrote! But I gleaned from this short note another interesting fact. As I reflected upon it, it seemed a very natural corollary of the proposition. The worship was more prevalent in tropical countries, and among the least advanced of humanity. The reason was obvious. They were nearer the jungle, both physically and mentally. I also suspected that it would be common among the dwellers of such lands near the ocean. The isolated incident of the Devil's Cauldron substantiated this belief. With some satisfaction in my heart, I left the metaphysical library when I had finished my search for the day. As I crossed the sidewalk to the parking station where I'd left my car, I stood still in my tracks, gazing with horror upon the sight that met my eyes. A dirty, tousled figure was dashing along the street, pursued by 2 policemen. He was clad in the lightest of garments that looked more like underwear or sleeping clothes than anything else. He stumbled occasionally, but some instinct seemed to enable him to keep out of the grasp of his pursuers. He was carrying something, which he balanced with great dexterity. I looked closely as he approached me, and saw that it was a tank filled with water, and inside the tank was a collection of lizards, water snakes, etc. And as he approached me, eluding his pursuers by a hair, I saw that this man in pajamas was Dr. Prendergast. 6. Dead Flies. But what a changed Dr. Prendergast! His professional manner had disappeared. His usually benign face was twisted in a snarl of fury, and his teeth gnashed and champed like a jungle animal lusting for blood. The policeman explained that they had caught him robbing a nearby aquarium, and refused to believe his story that he had been ordered to take the reptiles that he still carried with such a jealous care. My professional card and reputation, however, satisfied the officers, and since the doctor refused to part with his treasure, saying he would die first, I finally agreed to pay for the stolen property, and the owner accepting my proposal, my friend was permitted to retain his prize. Throughout the journey back to the hospital, he babbled unceasingly about things I could barely understand. Hundreds of times he repeated the words master and B'Moth. He asserted that he had done the master's bidding in stealing the reptiles, and called upon the thing to reward him when the time came. I questioned him 100 times as to his reasons for stealing the tank and its contents, but a cunning look came into his eyes, and try as I would, I could not elicit from him any reason for his act. He clung to his statement that he had but done the bidding of the master, and that he was to be rewarded for it. His look held suspicion and distrust for me. Like that other poor creature, he sensed in me an enemy of his master. At times, I caught him leering at me with a murderous expression in his red-rimmed eyes, and I confess that I felt not wholly comfortable, there alone in a closed car with this madman who had been my friend. It was with something approaching a sigh of relief that I drove in at the broad entrance to the hospital where he was still confined. He showed no disposition to resist the attendants who came to take him to his room, and seemed satisfied in the belief that he had accomplished his end. When he entered his room, he carefully placed the tank and its contents upon a table in the center, and apparently gave it no further attention. I left him then, and went to the office of the hospital. The report was the same as usual. Dr. Prendergast had been sleeping well, eating, but his moments of lucidity were fewer and farther apart. Even then he seemed to brood under the weight of the obsession that was dominating him. He had developed a mania for collecting insects of all kinds. He had begged the authorities of the hospital to procure for him jams and other sweets, which, instead of eating, he placed in appropriate places about his room and waited for the vermin that are bound to be attracted by the preserves. His room was overrun with flies, ants, and mice, but instead of destroying them, he used every effort to encourage them. He had constructed boxes that acted as traps, and which the superintendent of the hospital informed us were filled to overflowing with various sorts of insects. He had one box filled with grasshoppers, another with ants, a third with flies, and so on. This occupation was something that I could not understand. What was his purpose? For I felt reasonably sure there was a purpose in making this collection. I could understand the tank of reptiles after my reading of Johannes. They were undoubtedly symbolic of the master himself. Perhaps he had caught them in the belief that they were kin of that thing. But the insects and vermin, these I could not explain at all. I was not to remain in darkness for long, however. On returning to the room, I stood outside for a moment and peered through the aperture in the door that is frequently used for observation purposes in mental cases. The simulated indifference of the doctor had passed away, and under the impression that he was now alone, he was working furiously. At first I could not understand his occupation, but soon it flashed upon me what his object was. In his hand was a box. It was filled with flies. In a semi-stupor, the man was slowly sprinkling handfuls of the pests out of the box, where they lay too weak to move. He then fed them carefully to the creatures within the tank. I noticed at his hand other empty cages, and supposed that they had been filled with ants and grasshoppers. He fed the last of the flies to a water snake, and with great contentment replaced the boxes in a neat pile upon a shelf. Grasping the handle of the door firmly, I entered the room, his face a mask of fury. My friend whirled upon me with a champing of teeth. Like a cornered tiger about to strike, he crouched against the wall. But with a smile, I seated myself upon a chair. Seeing this, and that I did not intend to interfere with his pets, he relaxed somewhat and sat upon the bed. His face was cast in a moody pattern. His brow was knit in a frown, as if pondering something. Slowly, the tensity of his body relaxed. His face assumed the normal lines of good humor that I had so often seen upon it, and he looked up. "By heaven, Randall, if what I think has happened, I am better off dead," he said. "No matter what has happened, I am pleased to see that you are still fighting," I answered. "Yes, but the effort is almost too much. I wanted to kill you when you came in. You'd better watch me, for I'm liable to do it the next time. A feeling came over me that you were in my way, or rather in the way of that hideous thing that has me in its power, and that you ought to be killed and fed to the sharks." "Why fed to the sharks?" I asked with much interest. "Because they're of the sea, devour each other. Every living thing they devour, if it is not of the sea, is another soul added to their power, to the power of B'Moth." "Extraordinary," I said in amazement. "That's the word. But I can't say how I know, but I feel it just the same, that the object of this business is to place an overwhelming power in the hands of the filthy abominations at the bottom of the sea, and in the depths of the jungle." "You're right there. I've discovered that. Is that why you've been feeding those land creatures to the reptiles in that tank?" He followed my pointing finger and shrank from his pets in abject terror. "Did I collect those things?" he asked quaveringly. "Yes. Can't you remember it?" "I have some idea of laying out bait for insects under the impress of a will stronger than my own, but why I have those snakes, I don't know." "You stole them this afternoon," I said quietly. "Stole them, eh? I can't remember that at all. This thing is getting a pretty tight grip upon me. I'm afraid that unless we can do something, I'm finished. I can't remember what I've been up to at all for the past few days. I'm losing this fight." "We'll pull you through. My idea is that you obtain the reptiles in order to feed the other things to them, and thus increase the proportion of souls for the deep. I can't explain it any better, but you can follow perhaps. You wanted to help this ghastly business by strengthening the mental influence of the master and his kind." I shuddered as I found myself using the word master so easily and familiarly. "No doubt you're right. I can't imagine any other reason for such an act. The very sight of these green, slimy things chills me now. I can't think of it without a shudder." "There's one thing I want to ask you." "Go ahead," said my friend without much enthusiasm. Are there any particular times when this thing comes to you?
No particular times, but on certain occasions. By Jove, I ought to have thought of it before. It's when there is fog outside that I experience the drowsy feeling that precedes these attacks.
I could not repress a cry when I heard this. I remembered my own experience in the automobile that night, now so long ago as it seemed. The drowsy feeling had come to me with its stupefying accompaniment when the fog had rolled in through the cracks of the car. It had disappeared when I lighted the heater. An idea came to me, a possible means of saving my friend in his extremity. I rang the bell for an attendant. "Lay a fire, and light it immediately," I ordered. The attendant looked at me in amazement. The day was a hot one, and my order must have seemed as crazy as the sick man's ant collecting. "Hurry," I snapped, as I saw the look that I was coming to know spreading across the face of the patient. The attendant flew like the wind, realizing that the matter must be important. While I anxiously watched the struggle that was, I know, going on in the mind of my friend, the fire was laid. Beads of perspiration stood out on his forehead. His jaw was gritted in fierce resolve as he watched the attendant futilely attempting to ignite the kindling. There was no time to waste. I dashed out of the room and into the dispensary. My eyes found a bottle of alcohol. Snatching this from the hand of a startled intern, I ran back to the room as fast as my legs would carry me. Dr. Prendergast was writhing upon the bed and clawing frantically at the tenuous wisps of grey mist that seemed to be stretching out their sinuous tentacles to draw him into their clutch. They seemed actually imbued with life, as I am convinced they were. He lay upon the bed as though trying to hide from the relentless purpose of this thing that strove to blast his sanity. The alcohol flew from my hand, the match ignited it, and the flames licked greedily at the kindling. The thin wisps of mist writhed and twisted, and gradually vanished as the fire gained volume and roared a menace to this thing from the depths. Upon the bed lay the racked form of my colleague, shuddering and weak, but smiling, and in his right mind. 7. More light. "We've won!" he cried jubilantly, grasping my hand. "Rather say, we are winning." I smiled, pleased at the success of my experiment. "Don't let that fire out, no matter how hot it becomes in here, or you'll soon find out that this business isn't finished. Look, can't you see it out there on the lawn? That mist twisting and curling like a thwarted thing. It's alive, I'll swear. If you let that fire out or open this window, it'll be after us again with a vengeance. Don't forget, keep that fire burning night and day. It's life or death now." I left immediately, for I had much to do. I hurriedly drove to Brocklebank, a small town in the country. Stopping the car before the portals of a large residence, I rang the bell. The servant, who knew me well, ushered me without introduction into the library of my old friend, Geoffrey Darlencourt, a student of antiquities and strange beliefs. I wondered that I had not thought of him before. I broached the subject on my mind without further delay. "What do you know of the worship of the Behemoth, Jeff?" He wrinkled his brows quizzically. "The Behemoth? Well, a little. It's apparently a mythical monstrosity that has been the focus of various forms of Satanism, pseudo-religion, and downright butchery." I told him about my investigations into the writings of the medieval philosophers, and what I had learned about the thing. "In that case, you probably know more than I can tell you," he said with a smile. "Except that you perhaps have never seen the worship actually practiced." "No, indeed," I said. "That's what I came to see you about." "Well, I have. The name apparently has innumerable variations, but always the main idea is the same. I've sometimes been tempted to think that there may be some such thing in reality.
You know, of course, that the so-called savage peoples are given to all forms of voodooism, animism, and the like. We say, in our sophistication, that this is only because they have not yet learned a true sense of values. I am often inclined to think that it is because they are freer in their subjective processes than we are. They think that a tree has power for good and ill. We say it is not possible. And yet Bose, for instance, to mention only one of the great scientists, has conclusively proved that a plant has feelings of joy and pain, and actually cries aloud when hurt. These people, being more readily receptive to influences that we deem spiritual because we cannot otherwise comprehend them, are naturally those among whom such a worship might find a firm foothold. The nearer we go to life in its bold reality, the nearer we come to the worship of the behemoth and other allied things. Do you mean to imply that this worship is beneficial? I questioned in some surprise. I won't say that, but I will say that it serves a very definite purpose in filling a gap that we of civilized times have left void. But to return, if you want to find examples of behemoth worship, look for them among the lower strata of society, in the hot countries, among the aboriginals of New Zealand and so on. It was in such places that I found innumerable instances of it on my recent cruise. I confess that I was greatly surprised at the prevalence of the thing. It is spreading at an alarming rate. Tell me the details, I said breathlessly. Apparently, I was on the trail at last. Substantially, the worship is the same everywhere, and its very similarity gives it the appearance of representing a widespread truth. It appears to be related to a living thing. The great idea back of it is that the time is rapidly approaching when the jungle will return to its own, when civilization will be wiped out, and the law of power will again prevail. Apparently this behemoth has never been seen, but it can be felt. I almost believe I have felt it myself. Incantations are made in a language absolutely unintelligible to anybody. The medicine men themselves have told me that they cannot apprehend the meaning except through the medium of traditional translations. And here is another strange thing. Though I have seen this worship in New Guinea and Peru, in Malaysia and Finland, the syllables have always a similarity. The incantations are seemingly the same. They sound like unintelligible gibberish, more like the language of apes or the roar of the sea lion than speech. Yet they are pronounced nearly alike by these widely separated races. Randall, they mean something. Again, I felt my flesh beginning to creep at the thought of the tremendous power with which I had to deal. What is the central feature of this worship? There are two. A mystic union with the behemoth, which means a pledge to aid in the restoration of the jungle and the overthrow of civilization. And secondly, the objective side, which includes the sacrifice of unbelievers, usually to members of the reptilian species, though I have seen children given to jaguars, which were kept as sacred symbols. I suppose there are even places here where this abomination holds sway, I suggested with a flutter of anxiety. Not a doubt of it. The thing is apparently gaining currency everywhere. Why not here? I could almost tell you where to look to find the worship practiced. I then told Darlancourt everything that had led me to make these inquiries. When I had finished, his face was tense and fearful. This is monstrous. I can scarcely believe it. If it is true, we must take steps immediately to root out this cancerous putridity at its very heart. Wait. He walked across to the bookcase and selected a volume. For some minutes he read in silence. Then he spoke. There appear to be some secret orders founded upon this worship. The names will, in all probability, be changed, but they may be similar enough for us to spot them. One is the macrocosm. Another is the Order of Behemoth, a very ancient one, originating in Egyptian times, and worshipping as its symbol the hippopotamus. If my memory serves me aright, The word for hippopotamus in the language of the Third Dynasty was behemoth, very similar to behemoth, you see. Now we shall ascertain if there are any relics of this business in 20th century America." He lifted the telephone receiver, and a chill dread came over me. I felt again that overwhelming fear that presaged the coming of the thing. Darlancourt was speaking. "Secret Service? Give me Ellery. Tell him it is Darlancourt." "Yes, please." "Hello? Yes, this is Jeff. I want to know whether you have any reports on secret societies that bear a name like Behemoth, B'Moth, or Behemoth, a name something similar to that." He listened for a while. "What? Good heavens! We'll be over right away." He turned to me, and his face was grey. "He says there are known to be societies throughout the world going by the name Behemoth, and others with similar names, and that after raiding them, the police have discovered bones, human bones, charred and, in many cases, buried. He says these societies have been suspected of incendiarism, dynamiting, and the like. Randall, you have put your finger upon the worst sore the human race has yet to cauterize." 8. The High Priest. We found Ellery caressing a beautiful police dog, a pet which he had trained from puppyhood. Darlancourt rapidly described to the Secret Service man what I had already told him. Ellery received the information, at first with a quizzical smile, but under the accumulation of evidence that we were able to present, his face took on a grave mien. He called his secretary, and instructed him to obtain a certain address, and send a telegram to the Secret Service departments of every civilized country, in code. He added, "Inquire if there have been any signs of an attempt, what shall I say?" He stopped, looking helplessly at us. "Ask if there have been any overt attempts that appear to be directed by secret societies to rehabilitate the life of primitive times at the present day," I put in suggestively. "But they'll think me crazy. They won't know what I mean." "They'll know well enough if they have run into anything like what we are dealing with here," said Darlancourt quickly. "If they don't, they will only think the cable has been garbled in transmission." "All right, put in something like that. Ask particularly if they have had any trouble from groups of people who worship any animal or any reptile, particularly one that resembles a hippopotamus." "Very well, sir," said the secretary with a slight smirk. "That's all," snapped Ellery. We left the office together and drove to the meeting place that the detective wished us to visit. Ugly rumors had been associated with it, and there was some probability that we should find what we sought there. The night was fast falling as we approached the hall. It was in a squalid and miserable section of the city. We parked the car some distance away, and mingling with the motley throng that sought admission, we entered the building and seated ourselves near the rear door. The place was almost filled, and very soon after our entry the lights commenced to dim. They dwindled to mere dots of green flame, and there arose a chorus of meaningless babble like the chatter of apes in the forests of the Amazon. This was evidently the greeting extended to the high priest of Behemoth, who was now entering. He was clothed in a shining green robe that was apparently made from the skin of some monster of the deep. Like decaying fish, it glowed a bluish green, and surrounded the repulsive features of a mask that he wore with a fiendish, unnatural light. Slowly, he mounted the steps to the rostrum. I saw that there was before him a tank which glowed with that lambent blue fire that I had seen in the glass when the insane man had died in the German-American hospital. I found it impossible to repress a shudder. The place was almost dark, and except for the priest on the rostrum, we could see nothing but the tiny points of green that indicated the colored electric lights. There appeared to be no ceremonial or ritual in connection with the business. Everybody did as he pleased, but always there was that wild jargon that reminded me of the forest. At my left was a woman with pendulous jowl and huge teeth projecting from between thick lips. Her shouts almost rent my eardrums. As the affair went forward, the crowd became ecstatic, and many threw themselves in transports upon the floor, tearing their clothes away from their bodies and dancing wildly in the darkness. Many carried tame serpents which they lovingly caressed. Others had tiny monkeys which they kissed affectionately. Men and women alike threw themselves upon each other in a frenzy of mad abandon. I saw a Malay struggling in the arms of a white woman and heard their shouts of ecstasy. I saw others sinking teeth deep into the arms, the legs, the shoulders of those nearest to them in an insane fury of primeval ferocity. There was a beautiful girl, her body stripped naked, lying in the embrace of a bronze figure, drinking in with passionate abandon the kisses he showered upon her. Apes flitted hither and thither among the crazed throng, receiving homage wherever they passed. Serpents writhed, their coils encircling the throats of the devotees, and the shouting rose to a bedlam. The air was becoming thicker every minute. I could not understand it at first, but soon it was clear to me. I had seen that heavy greenish vapor before. It was the breath of that hellish atrocity that these deluded wretches worshipped. It seemed to overhang the whole hall, enveloping all in its clammy folds. I felt the sickly touch of it, and writhed as though in the grip of some loathsome thing. My companions sat there with drawn faces, their muscles tensed in an effort to resist the awful spectacle. The cries rapidly blended themselves into a rhythmical shouting. Into my dazed senses there was borne the sound of a single phrase. "B'Moth, Master." It was repeated 1,000 times as the heavy pall closed in upon us, thicker and thicker. The man sitting at my side spoke to me in a roar of joy. "The Master is almost ready," he shouted above the din. "A few more days and the world will feel his power." He beat his brows and cried in ecstasy, "Come, B'Moth, Master, come!" I nodded in pretended agreement, and he went on with his shouting. A woman threw her arms about me and whispered foul things into my ear. Suddenly, the attention of the crowd was centered upon the priest at the rostrum. He had uncovered the tank of water upon the platform, and to my horror I saw there, with jaws agape, a huge crocodile. It seemed clothed with a sulphurous glow like everything else. Into the pandemonium of noise there was injected a new and startling sound, a shriek, shrill and piercing in its power, the voice of a woman in mortal terror. I strained my eyes through the heavy vapor and saw, good God, it was a woman that this monstrous priest held aloft over the tank. His purpose was plain. He intended to feed her to the thing in the water. I stared in horror, paralyzed. I could not lift an arm to save her. At my side there roared a deafening blast. A spurt of flame pierced the night. Ellery had fired his automatic. In fascinated horror, I saw the tank splinter as the bullet pierced it. Water poured forth, iridescent and phosphorescent, covering the devotees. The crocodile slithered to the floor and floundered among those nearest him. His red-smeared jaws champed furiously at the arms and legs of the people in the front seats, while Ellery fired and fired. At last he found his mark. The crocodile writhed in mortal agony, flapped his tail, striking 6 men who were bowing before him, and died. The priest dropped the girl and commenced to run. In his haste, the mask which covered his face became dislodged and fell to the ground. I stared in stark horror at the lust-distorted visage that was revealed to me. 9. Jaws of the Jungle. The girl came dashing up the aisle and disappeared into the street. We were in a dangerous position. The frenzied mob turned upon us with murderous lust, and scratching, punching, and panting, we were borne to the floor. Again Ellery's gun spat lead and flame, and the crowd edged away from him. In the lull, we dashed for the door, and escaped across the street into the car. We saw the girl standing in the street. Hastily telling her to get into the car, we drove back to the office of the detective. When we arrived, we found the secretary in great distress. The police dog that Ellery loved so much appeared to have been taken suddenly ill. The detective excused himself and left the room. We heard him outside, calling the dog. There was a patter of canine feet, then a snarling growl. We heard a heavy body thud to the ground, and a cry of pain. Darting to the door, we saw a sight that sickened us. Ellery lay upon the floor, and blood was streaming from his throat. He was dead before we reached him. And as the dog, half wolf, wholly wild, stood there, growling at us, the unspeakable enmity of those eyes, touched with a devilish light, bespoke the fiend, the devourer, Behemoth. Around him there curled a thin wisp of yellow vapor. Darlancourt picked up Ellery's revolver from the table and fired at the brute. The dog fell dead, and as he fell, was it true, or did my distraught nerves belie my senses? I thought I heard an ominous rumble from the dark recesses of the room, as the vapor floated out of the window and vanished. 10. The Scourge of B'Moth. It did not need the statement of the girl whom we had brought with us to convince us that the day was near when the whole horde of the jungle would attempt to overrun civilization. The telegrams without exception told of a series of attempts to the same end. Several of them, in fact, employed the word B'Moth, showing clearly that the incidents were all connected by some strong, central purpose. But we were still in the dark and ignorant of the time and place of the attempt. The thing was expected to raise its head in Argentina, Africa, India, and a dozen other countries. How could we hope to deal with them all at the same time? What we did do, however, was to cable to the police forces of the entire world, telling them to watch diligently and be on their guard for any invasion from the jungle or from the sea. Probably our message sounded fantastic to them, but we made it as convincing as possible. This done, we set about for a means to protect our own people from the menace which we felt was imminent. After some thought, I found a possible means to forestall these hideous things. It was a daring one, and risky, not to be attempted without the full consent of Dr. Prendergast. I telephoned the hospital and asked if he was there. I learned that he was, and that the hospital authorities had succeeded in rekindling the fire which a careless attendant had allowed to die some time previously. The doctor was rapidly recovering. I requested the office to connect me with him, and he replied cheerily enough. He was quite unable to furnish me with any information of the sort that I desired. Finally, I made the proposal that I had in mind. It was the only way that offered even a possible solution of the problem. "Are you willing to do something for the cause of humanity?" I asked. "What is it that you want me to do?" he asked rather anxiously. He had already been in dire peril, and I could well believe that he feared the thing more than anything else in the world. "I want you to let that fire die out again for a few minutes," I said slowly and distinctly. "Good heavens, I can't do that. You know what it would mean." "Yes, I know. And because the matter is so important, I ask you to do this. We will be outside and ready to light it again, so you will not be powerless. Why do you want me to do this? There is a chance that you may be able to tell us when this invasion will occur. If it is to be soon, all the followers of the Master will have to know it. You must try to remember all that occurs while the fire is out. Will you do this? It's a lot, but I'll do it, he said resolutely. We hurried over to the hospital and watched through the aperture of the door while Dr. Prendergast allowed the fire to flicker slowly to death. His face greyed with fear as the last sparks died down and the ashes cooled. I could see, even from that distance, the great drops of perspiration breaking out upon his brow as the insidious influence stole over him. The room darkened, and the tendrils of vapour slowly gathered about him. He lay upon the bed like one dead, but by his breathing I could see that he was still alive. I saw the distorted ferocity that I had come to know so well these last few days spread over his regular features. I heard the grunts that came from him as from some wild animal. He snarled and spat in a very fury of savage lust as he became metamorphosed from the doctor into the demon. No longer did he lie motionless, but he moved excitedly about and began to talk in a language meaningless to me. He seemed to be holding a lengthy conversation, but at last he struggled, as though attempting to throw off some fearful oppression, and I knew that it was time to relight the fire. I entered the room, resolutely shunning the dampness that sought to envelop me with its coils. I soon had a bright fire burning, and slowly the good doctor revived. "Do you remember anything?" I questioned anxiously. "Yes, I remember all. I can scarcely credit it. There will be an invasion from the ocean with the next full moon. Monsters will attempt to blot out the whole civilized world, and the followers of B'Moth are expected to help in the destruction. I myself have been ordered to help." "You're sure that it's to be with the next full moon?" I interjected earnestly. "Yes, the next full moon. When is that?" I consulted the calendar. "It's a week from today," I said. "Have you any idea where the attempt will commence?" I suggested. "None whatever, but I suppose it will be somewhere in this country," he said dejectedly. "Well, we'll be on our guard everywhere," I said. Darlincourt and I left the hospital, and hurrying to the Secret Service offices, we again sent several telegrams and also radio messages to ships at sea. We requested everyone to keep a sharp watch for any accumulation of monsters both at sea and on land. We spent some days of enforced idleness, and were becoming hopeless of being able to prevent the awful catastrophe that was about to overwhelm us. We had had great difficulty in influencing the War Department in the matter, but finally they had consented to order the forts in various parts of the country to fire upon anything extraordinary belonging to the animal world. That was as far as they would go, and the order was given more out of courtesy than anything else, and who can blame them? They were used to fighting armies and not spirits. As the day of the full moon approached, the armed forces of a world united for the sake of civilization were mustered and anxious. Then came the message. It was from the steamer Malalana, plying between San Francisco and Hawaii. The broadcast that we had sent out a few days earlier had been effective. The captain reported that he had seen a school of monstrous things swimming rapidly toward the mainland, directly upon the steamer routes forming the great circle to Honolulu. There were thousands of them, like enormous blanket fish, huge beyond comparison, almost as large as his own ship. During the day, other messages came in from various vessels on the Great Circle route to Hawaii, and they all mentioned this huge array of things. The Presidio at San Francisco was immediately notified, and we caught a fast airplane that took us to Chicago and Denver, and so to Mills Field.
It was the night of the full moon when we arrived at San Francisco. We motored hastily to the Presidio. Activity was everywhere. The enormous disappearing guns that can shoot a shell 30 miles were ready to hurl distraction at the invading hordes from the deep. The scout planes hovered aloft to signal the approach of the invaders. Telescopes were trained anxiously upon the starlit Pacific. Fort Miley was a scene of activity also. The naval stations at Bremerton and San Diego were watching for any change of course on the part of the hordes from the ocean. And with the full moon, they came. The ocean for miles was a seething, swirling mass of horrid immensity. Green bodies sucked their way through the smooth water. The swish of their swimming was plainly audible to the watchers on the lookouts of the Presidio. "Fire!" went forth the order, and the range guns belched a message of death. Again and again, shells were hurled into the center of the bloated creatures. Still they came on, slowly, relentlessly, ceaselessly. The air was a deafening hell of shrieks and blasts as the guns did their work. The ocean was red with the blood of the things, and still they came on. Mines were exploded outside the Golden Gate, mines placed there to blow up battleships, but still the things came on. Airplanes dropped bomb after bomb upon the horde, and came back for more ammunition, but still the advance continued. A dense fog that I had learned to dread was enveloping the sea, the breath of Behemoth himself coming to general his forces. Time after time the guns spoke. The very hills shook. From Fort Miley there came thunder too. Battleships anchored in Navy Row steamed to the mouth of the Golden Gate and hurled broadside after broadside at the monsters. They were slowing up now, and their number was greatly reduced, but still the advance was not halted. At last came frantic word from the Coast Guard station at the beach that they were landing. The panic-stricken people were leaving their homes to see them crushed beneath the weight of the horde like so much matchwood. The guns laid down a concentrated barrage upon the landing place of the monsters and tore the beach to shreds. Under the glare of the huge searchlights I saw streams of sluggish red where the awful carnage went on. But at last they turned back to the sea whence they came. The fog lifted. Had the master met his fate? And the filthy things floundered heavily away from the shore, jostling the carcasses of thousands of their dead as they did so. Still the thunder of the guns followed them, far, far out to sea, to the extreme limit of their range. And when it was all over, we sank limp to the ground, speechless before the peril that had just confronted us. 11. Conclusion. Of course, the details were never made public, but on the following day we received cablegrams from all parts of the world, telling of a concerted attempt to regain power by these creatures of a dreadful past. From India came messages telling of invasions by hordes of tigers and mammoth elephants. From Africa of lions, all the wildlife of the forest. From Burma, stories of huge apes that crush the life out of men. From South America, all of the reptilian life of the Amazonian forests massed in relentless array. But, thanks to our knowledge of their purpose, the attempts were frustrated. The stories of incendiarism, of course, could not be kept out of the press. The dynamiting of the McAuliffe building in New York is common property. The butchery of Professor Atkinson in his laboratory of experimental hygiene is well known. Throughout the civilized world, the police forces were hard put to it to cope with the threatened overthrow of civilization. But civilization triumphed, and the forces of destruction were greatly reduced, although not destroyed. They can never be destroyed. Dr. Prendergast laughs at the fog now, and the rain has no terrors for me.
Was my surmise correct when those things turned tail and made again for the open sea? Is B'Moth dead? I wonder.
Devilskill by Vlek. I was a Boston man, born and bred, and it had been assumed that upon completion of my education I would ascend to the high courts of that noble burg to preside alongside my father and his brothers before me. But that was not to be. I've always followed my own singular course of curiosities to the exclusion of all else as a siren's call, to my ultimate doom, or so it was believed by the scattered remains of my family, as they clung to the safe harbours of this country's burgeoning modern enclaves. In my grandfather's time, you could drive the coast of these here United States from the tip of the Gator Highway northward to where the land stopped being America and decided to become something else. The farthest reaches of that lonely old track hugged the sea for dear life, and one wrong turn on a foggy night would send the careless traveller straight away into the bosom of the great by and by. The angry cresting waves have a way of calling out to folks too, whispering in half-familiar voices long dead and promising unimaginable delights no man's got any right to wish for. I began to learn more of these matters upon the death of my father's father, when a large cache of mouldering papers, diaries, and crumbling yellow documents dating from the time of the original colonies came into my possession upon the great patriarch's sudden demise. Of that desolate coast and my ancestral village of Devilskill, overlooking the sea, many troubling details emerged that hinted at vague warnings and allusions to unnamed horrors. These became an obsession to me, and I swore to find out about my family connection to this strange crust of land and the ancient village that sat upon the spot where the road stopped. Travelling northward 2 hours from Boston, one comes to a crossroads where a sharp turn to the left brings you back into the habited lands and the pleasant, genial society of the humble tillers of the soil. But if for some curious reason you miss the turn towards the inland side, you'll see the trees, thin and ragged, become twisted spires bereft of any green, leaving only windswept skeletal corpses to grasp the heavens, their shadows gathering furtively along the road at eventide. Once you leave the main highway, the road to Devilskill crosses a vast tidal flat that reeks of the sea and dead things, rotted animals, fish, and foul, wispy fingers of greenish mist and fumes rising listlessly and wafting into the village. If, for whatever reason or by careless misadventure, you stay your course upon this solitary track until you can proceed no further lest you plunge into the sea, then you have come to Devilskill, a mouldering burg collapsed upon itself and leaving no more than a fading memory of happier times than these. Some of the sons and daughters of Devilskill escaped to warmer, healthier climes, never to return from the inland side to the village for holiday feasts and pints of festive drink, for no merrymaking is ever observed in that ancient village. Indeed, should some lone traveller venture along that rutted slip of road, they will observe how seldom the wheels of the modern automobile pass that way, for the ancient hobnailed cart had made its mark upon the earth in bygone times, from the inland side all the way to the sea. These things I learned from the pages of my grandsire's crumbling diaries. This had been the way of things in my grandfather's time, even though at the time of his own escape from Devilskill he had been a mere lad of some 10 years. In the most ancient of days, things were different. The inland side and Devilskill enjoyed a hearty commerce among themselves, and
many joyous holiday comings and goings were held between these two most congenial of burgs. The folk of Devilskill had always drawn their subsistence and trade goods, as well as beautiful ornaments prized by the ladies, from the sea, and made their fortune selling far and wide up and down to the coastal towns. Then one day, the story goes, an old codger by the name of Jubblemarsh took his boats out upon the waters with his sons. The clouds turned black without warning, and a violent gale demanded he return immediately to shore. The old fisherman paid no heed to these warnings, even though the boats commanded by his sons turned around quickly and made for shore, believing their father was right behind them. But the storm grew so wild they lost sight of the old man and his small boat, and prayed he'd find his way safely to shore. A week later, the family surrendered to their grief and declared that Jubblemarsh, one of the oldest patriarchs of the town, was no more, taken finally into the bosom of the sea forever. Imagine everyone's surprise when 1 month later the old man pulled his boat ashore and emptied his nets, all gorged and straining with treasures hauled up from the deep, the like of which no man among the fishing clans had ever laid eyes upon before. The opinion was mixed as to whether old Jubble's return was a miracle or something not to be celebrated at all, even though the old fisherman was held in high and affectionate regard. It's just that some things are not to be trusted among people living in such close proximity to the sea. In time, things quieted down, as they always do, and what the old fisherman brought ashore in his nets, both of the comestible variety and the ornamental, proved such a delight that it soon transformed the meagre economy of Devilskill to one of wealth and luxury. But when Jubblemarsh and his sons loaded up his wagons with those curious conch-like creatures and tiny unshelled swimmers of an unsettlingly human-like form and face, and certain fabulous crowns and necklaces of the finest gold, yet undeniably ghastly to behold, well, the good folk of the inland side would have no part of it, and ran the Marsh clan off and made it clear that they were never to return on peril of dire consequences. So none of the folk of Devilskill ever again crossed the tidal flat to set foot upon the streets of the neighbouring towns, and it's been that way from before my grandfather's time to my very own. But surely these were nothing more than foolish myths, akin to the ridiculous whisperings about Innsmouth and its curious folk that populates the fantastical nightmares of those who, generation after generation, never stray too far from home. I scoffed at this nonsense and refused to let it keep me from discovering even the slightest bit of history about my forebears that might prove of interest to me. I always eschewed the pressured expectations of my family in favor of pursuing my own interests in life, interests that were often best kept to myself, though I never broke the laws of any king or country. So when the huge valise stuffed with papers purloined from my grandfather's attic and the boxes of mouldy diaries were bequeathed to me, my father was visibly dismayed, but I was delighted. The day this trove arrived on my doorstep, I set aside everything and buried myself within its many secrets. A few things were readily apparent. Devilskill, an intriguing name, derived from the old Dutch kill, or tidal inlet creek. It was also the sister city, a generous term in the best of times, of fabled Innsmouth itself, and I trembled with foreboding and wonder at any connection I might share with that dying seaport and its storied folk. There must be some meaning to the madness, the decay, the ghoulish tales surrounding Innsmouth and my own family history, and I knew with certainty that my path lay straight before me into the streets of Devilskill. All I had to do was drive up there, ask around for any memories about my grandfather, explore a bit, visit a few old graves, and generally be welcomed warmly into the bosoms of the town fathers as the returning prodigal son, if only that had been the case. I was ready for Devilskill, though. It was to be a lark, really, a holiday, a road trip where at best I might find a few colourful yarns about my ancestors, What could be the harm in that? Other than old stories, perhaps about my grandfather's youth, there wasn't much that could come of it, really. These small-towners were hardly my people, and beyond a few minutes of small talk over a pint in the pub, where could it go? I set out upon the old highway at dawn, and watched for all the landmarks I knew from local stories, and my grandfather's diaries, which I carried in my valise. I also carried a few photos in case the local crowd needed some proof of my lineage. My grandfather, Leviathan Gilman, was by no means a handsome man, and I bore an unmistakable resemblance to what my mother always called the look of her husband's side of the family. I thought perhaps I might see some hints of this look on the streets that could provide a sort of entree to casual conversation. I knew from experience that most small towns don't welcome strangers poking about and resented the influx of weekenders scouring their shops for bargains and turning up their noses at the local grub and modest accommodations. No, I knew my way around these sorts of places and how to comport myself among all manner of human flora and fauna, and so I set off for a rousing good time. By the time I reached the foreboding turn-off for Devilskill, it was mid-afternoon. Being the middle of summer, I still had plenty of time to get to the village, take in a lay of the land, and then secure a hotel to serve as my base of operations. I sped through the thinning trees, all sickly and barren, and headed into the floodplain at low tide that surrounded Devilskill like an embrace. It made no sense that the land beyond the main road should succumb to high tides when the village itself did not. Just one more mystery that should make for an interesting visit. I'd long pursued a writing career, but as that big break never brightened my door, I thought maybe the quirky travelogue with a personal interest angle might spring the padlock to my fame and fortune. I abruptly pulled onto the main drag, Jubal's Keep, obviously renamed for that ancient marsh mariner, and discovered the street was just 6 blocks long, with 3 streets on either side lined with low wooden houses of the most ancient and squalid sort. This destroyed all hopes of finding anything charming and quaint to occupy my time here. It was Jubal's Keep that all but defied description. There was little but crumbling and decrepit one-story buildings that had served the fishing and whaling trades of the last century. Rustic old storefronts advertising dry goods, simple farmer stalls, mostly collapsed and unused, and even an old boarded-up livery, all reminders of times long past. Many a town along the coast belies this ancestry with clapboard row houses, abandoned brick factories, and simple workmen's tenements, with the odd grand house for the pleasure of the owner. Such places were doomed to never rise above their station because there was nothing to restore and renovate, nothing to draw the influx of fresh blood or holiday trippers beyond the morbidly curious such as myself. There was, of course, a run-down pub, with a weather-worn sign, and an old inn of the same vintage. Of the pub, Drowned Man's Shanty. More will be said later. There were only a handful of people on the street, all locked up in dark fishermen's overcoats and broad oilcloth hats, and who all stopped and stared at me as I drove past them, heading towards the Whately house in search of a room. I parked right in front of the joint, not seeing another car parked anywhere in sight, and I wondered if there was some kind of law against it, and figured I'd ask at the front desk. I tried the door handle, but it was locked, though no closed or open sign was anywhere in sight. I knocked on the glass door, and after a few minutes a strange old wrinkled face peeked out at me from behind filthy, ragged lace curtains. The man must have been asleep and taken a hell of a fright at my intrusion, for his eyes bulged nearly out of his head, and his wide, flabby lips wobbled silently as he angrily waved me away. "I need a room," I said, smiling and trying to look as friendly as possible. A room for the night? Surely you can't be all booked up. I'm Fred Gilman. My grandfather Leviathan was from here, and I hoped—" The man waved me angrily away again, cutting me off before I could even finish my explanation. "Ain't a hotel no more. Go away," he simpered, letting the rags fall back over the window. "Is there somewhere else?" I yelled after him, peering into the gloom of the deserted lobby. But he was gone. "Ain't nowhere else, mister," a high-pitched old voice croaked coyly behind me, nearly sending me into the street on my backside in shock. Before me stood a leathery, withered crone, dressed in the style of the Dutch or Mennonite school, old-time religion. Barely 5 feet tall, she was covered in homespun sackcloth and an apron that hung clear to her ankles, where the boniest legs I'd ever seen seemed to swim in a pair of ancient buckle shoes. The head was concealed in a tiny white cap or bonnet, and was tied tight under her chin. She also had the bulging eyes and broad flappy lips of the innkeeper, and I wondered if they were related. "Nowhere?" I asked in disbelief. "Not even for a night?" "Nowhere. Not even for an hour," she chirped. "Nobody comes here, and nobody stays the night. You best be gone. Git while you still can," she croaked, glaring at me up and down suspiciously. "I'm Fred Gilman. My grandfather—" But again I was cut off with the wave of a curiously broad gloved hand. "I heard you," she screeched. "I knows who you are, and who you be from, and I say you best git before the waters come and there be no road no more. And I'll be saying you friendly like, don't come back not ever, nothing for you here." Then she was gone, and I felt the light, cheerful breeze with which I had so recently trimmed my sails turn south and disappear towards the safety of the landward side. This was bothersome. Perhaps I had been naive to think the city fathers would launch a parade down the main drag of town for the return of the lost scion, metaphorically speaking, of course. But I was not going to go scuttling into the shadows and running for home at the first sight of opposition, in the very sort of place where such opposition is to be expected. By my calculations, I still had time before the high tides rolled in to do a bit more snooping, and what better place to gather information than the local pub? A few rounds never fails to loosen tongues and get them wagging. Leaving the car where it was, I set off for Drowned Man's shanty. The door here stuck too, but it finally gave way and I stumbled in, catching the furtive, surprised glances of a half-dozen old salts, similarly attired in heavy fishermen's greatcoats, hats, and gloves as the other denizens I'd seen around town. From the looks of them, one and all they were my grandfather's kin, having the same look and cast to the eyes, but to a much more severe and disquieting degree. After a moment or two, they all returned to their pints and whatever whispered conversations they'd been engaged in. The barkeep was a great brute of a man of the same ilk, his heavy forearms and jaw tense in preparedness as he eyed me without a word. "Can I get a pint?" I barked, trying to hide my growing irritation. "I don't know. Sit down and find out," he croaked, as though on his deathbed from consumption. I pulled up a stool at the bar and climbed on, and in due course a large mug of something brown and frothy appeared in front of me. I took a sip and found it a remarkably wretched and watered-down variety of what I was looking for. I glanced around and saw the old woman who had spoken to me on the street peering through the window, glaring at me, and then moving on. I tried to start a few conversations with my fellow soaks, but was ignored or rebuked with every attempt. Even my offers to buy a round fell seemingly on deaf or uninterested ears. I sat there through 3 pints of the miserable grog, refusing to surrender my perch, while the other patrons eyed me suspiciously, whispering and glancing my way. Then the barkeep reached behind the bar, drew out a huge handbell, and started ringing it violently over his head, whereupon the place cleared out in damn near a stampede. I looked around and stared at the barkeep. "You gotta clear out now, fella,"
he said, pulling off his foul apron and tossing it behind the bar. What the bloody hell? I roared. It's not even dark yet. Who closes up at this hour? Not closing, it's just time is all, he said, as though this explained everything. The man grabbed me roughly by the arm and shoved me out onto the sidewalk. Then he closed and locked the door behind us. I watched as he hurried up the street towards the port like he was late for something on threat of the greatest peril. Come back later if you must. I open back up afterwards for a bit, he yelled back at me as an afterthought, without turning around. I went back to the car and sat there, watching as apparently every house and hovel emptied onto the street, and the whole town swarmed silently toward the dilapidated wharf, and then they were gone. I decided maybe it was best to leave Devilskill to itself for tonight. So I drove back up Jubal's Keep and pulled out of town. I planned to get a hotel over on the landward side, a good hot meal, a warm bed from a friendly innkeeper, and start fresh in the morning with round 2 of my search. That plan was quickly abandoned when the road suddenly disappeared beneath the misty, rising waters, and I could go no further. I had no recourse but to drive back into Devilskill and find a relatively secluded place for the car, where I resigned myself to spending the night curled up on the front seat. Since I had my grandfather's papers, I pulled those out and reread a bit until, mercifully, I fell asleep. I still had not seen a soul on the streets since the last of the swarm disappeared toward the wharf. I jerked awake suddenly with the sound of the barkeep's bell ringing as though from the belfry of St. John's itself of an Easter morn. The streets were alive with dark-clad figures making their way soundlessly up the street and disappearing back into every doorway. I saw the lights go on in Drowned Man's Shanty and made my way to that dreary little pub in search of any living companionship. My attempts at friendly banter were ignored as before, and I'd barely finished the first pint of the tepid brackish grog before I gave up and returned to the car in search of whatever sleep I might have coming to me, despite the foul, heavy mists from the tidal flats that filled the streets. Then, miraculously, once again I slept. I awoke in pain and slowly stretched my knotted limbs and faced the tepid sun as it struggled to rise through the fog over Devilskill. I dragged my fingers through my hair and then strode off toward Drowned Man's Shanty in search of coffee and whatever passed for breakfast in this desolate hamlet. I'll have coffee and whatever's ready for breakfast, I said cheerfully, as though this was an established routine of long standing. The coffee appeared, and the handful of patrons cast their lidless eyes over me only briefly now, and went back to their furtive muttering, while a bowl of greenish slop was set in front of me. Chowder? I asked, eyeing the greasy bowl with its uncertain lumps bobbing languidly atop its gelatinous broth. But the barkeep just shrugged, then disappeared behind a pair of swinging doors. That's when I picked up the thread of conversation from one of the tables of dark-cloaked figures. "You seen them eyes?" one fellow muttered sharply in a hushed and sibilant tone, glancing over his shoulder at me in contempt. Or was it fear? Aye, we all have. His folk hail from around these parts close by, I'll wager, or I'll be damned for a minnow. Maybe even down Innsmouth way. Another voice chittered angrily. "Leave it to the matriarch, you fools," the first one snapped, assuming an authoritative tone. "She'll know what's best to be done with him, regardless of who his kin be. We don't know him, nor what brings him here." "You suppose he really is from Leviathan Gilman's line, like he says?" the barkeep added, pulling up a chair and joining the discussion of my possible identity. I chuckled to myself and drank my coffee, relishing every word. "You mean him that runned away to the landward side years back? Who can rightly say? But leave it to the matriarch, I say. She'll know best." And to this they all nodded in agreement,
continuing to mutter about him and who's to know and ain't scared, and several times, the look. Oh yes, the look all right. The motley old codgers finally shambled off, their peculiar loping gait common to everyone in town, it seemed. I called for a refill of the coffee, which I was growing used to, but didn't touch the chowder or whatever it was. This left me to simmer in my own thoughts, and what thoughts they were. Just 2 days in town, and I couldn't scare up a conversation of more than a handful of words, and some unknowing shrugs, and a couple of nodding recognitions of my grandfather's name. One old-timer even claimed to have known him in his boyhood, but refused to say any more, it being so very long ago. I'd wandered over every inch of Devilskill this side of the wharf, and had yet to see a single child or youth, nor was there any sign of a school or graveyard, those 2 pillars of normal society. I wondered if whatever faith the locals practiced demanded a burial at sea for their flock, but no children? This was highly irregular even for the old villages, and I thought maybe they stuck to some sort of homeschooling. I had given up any pretense of thinking this was any bastion of normalcy. The only place that brought to mind any sort of house of worship sat upon a solitary rise at the edge of the sea, past the rotting wharf, its twisted steeples reaching so high they disappeared like twin ram's horns into the clouds. I was jostled from my reverie by a heavy figure dropping onto the stool next to me. "The matriarch, is it?" the man said slowly, glancing at me out of the corner of his eye and glaring me up and down. "Let's move to a booth where I can rest these old bones and we can talk. Now, who's been gabbing in your ear about the matriarch?" His broad lips worked constantly, like he was chewing on a plug of tobacco, and it was all I could do not to turn away in disgust from his slack broad mouth and throbbing orbs. "Nobody," I replied sharply. "Eh? You sure about that?" he growled, setting his jaw like he was about to throw a punch in the general direction of my face. "Nobody. Well, I heard people talking here in the pub, whispering really, and glancing my way, talking about wondering if the matriarch knew I was in town and what she was planning on doing about it. Now, I'm asking you politely, gentleman to gentleman, who is this matriarch, and why would she be shining a keen eye in my direction, and why is everybody in this town so damned unfriendly? I feel like I'm about to get run out of town on a rail, or worse," I bellowed, determined to get to the bottom of this nonsense. The old man just stared at me through those weird lidless eyes that were so common to this neck of the woods. "Well, I'm waiting. And don't let anybody get any funny ideas about doing me harm. I'm armed and ready to defend myself," I said, moving my hand to my hip and revealing the Luger tucked in my waistband and ready for action. As expected, the gesture had the desired effect. The man's eyes bulged even further. Then he sighed and nodded in resignation. All right, then, settle down. I'll tell you all I know. The rest is for the matriarch to tell you herself, or show you, if she has a mind to. You're here, so what's done is done. Whole town knows you're here and who you are. Let's move on so's we can talk more open-like. Could take a while." We left the pub under the watchful eye of the barkeep, and sat on a rotted pier, while the old man gathered his thoughts or pondered how much to actually tell me. "So, you know this here town, Devilskill. It's a shunned place. Course you know. Folk for hundreds of miles around know the story of old Jubal Marsh who'd gone missing into the sea some 200 years back now, and what he dragged up from the brine when he come home was just not natural somehow. But folks got to make a living, and them Marshes made a right fine living dragging all kind of strange seafare like nobody never seen, and more, treasures and trinkets, gewgaws, gizmos and gadgets and doodads of fabulous and spectral design. Folks took it all to be the handicrafts of mermaids and sirens, and other sea folk less comely to look upon, and they figured old Marsh and his boys must have formed some kind of pact with something, some deal they'd all found to their liking. But before long all the folks on the inland side cut us off on peril of our very lives if we showed our faces in any of their towns henceforth. Said we was cursed on account of what old Jubal dragged up from the sea, and may just be they was right. Even the land itself turned agin us, and went all black and swampy at high tide between us and the inland side, and there's no hope of crossing until the water recedes. And them waters and green mists, you know, you seen 'em, they rise and recede when and how and if they got a mind to, not by any signs and designs of the moon and her natural courses. And that mess they leave behind, I know you seen it. Then one day an old black-covered buggy and mare, likes of which hadn't been seen in many a year, pulled in and made its way, slow as you please, right down the centre of town. That buggy and mare, it disappeared out back of the marsh place, and, I'll be damned, the way my grandpappy says his grandpappy told it, word started coming out that old Jubal had taken hisself a new wife. Now, both his boys was long dead by then, and their ma too, having passed by consumption some time back. Now this new wife was apparently quite the sight. Folks said she didn't look right somehow, had bulging lidless eyes and a mouth that— He paused nervously, clearing his throat and glancing away before beginning again. She had nary a hair on her head, when you seen her head at all, that is. She was all done up the way they do down around Arkham near the Aylesbury Pike and Sentinel Hill, thems that keep to themselves and follow some strict old-time religion nobody around here knew nothing about until then. At the time, a few folks started whispering about the Innsmouth look. Innsmouth being an old seaport some miles south, like our own Devilskill. You probably heard tell of it. It's still there. Some folks said Jubal's new wife had the Innsmouth look. Most folks had never had call to go down Innsmouth way, but it wasn't long before. The raspy old voice petered out, and I waited for him to compose himself. Well, this wife, name of Magnificent Marsh she was called, and they say she got a twin sister down in Innsmouth, name of Majestic Marsh, but who can say? I hear there were big doings there a while back. Now, like I was saying, she was quite the sight, this Magnificent Marsh, that she was. She kept to the button-down and covered-up ways, long black skirts that showed off her bony ankles, and old-time buckle shoes, a stiff white blouse with them sleeves the way they do, and long apron, and always one of them funny little white caps they wear, tied up tight under her chin. But it was that glare as though she sought to curse you to the Lord Almighty that skewered you where you stood. Only it wasn't knowed in the beginning just what Lord Almighty Jubal Marsh and his missus kept the Sabbath for. Now here— The old man paused to see where I stood with things so far, glaring at me and waiting for what reaction I could not guess. This is where things require a degree of faith and creative thinking, the old guy said, tapping the side of his head with a wink. A faith what most men just can't cipher. You see, it was with the arrival of this new wife that things changed here in Devilskill. All the friendly little churches shut down, and that new one sprung up almost overnight, that big un down by the sea, he said, waiting to see if I knew what he was getting on about. I just nodded to keep him talking. Well, it started in with a whole new worship that to this day I won't speak of with anybody who's not part of it. The fact that you're still walking around upright and breathing after poking your nose into private things means something. So I guess you gotta know a few things. Must be you got sanction on you. That wife of Jubal's, she come to be known as the matriarch, 'cause she took the whole town under her wing, as they say, and guided them all into some newfangled ways. And that matriarch, Magnificent Marsh, is with us to our very own times, and is like unto a mother to us all.
You seen her for herself, I knows you have. You seen that buggy and mare, too." The man stopped talking, and I just sat there stifling a grin, but not wanting to ballyhoo an old-timer who might not be pulling the same string of fish as he used to. "I'm damned serious," he roared. "My friend," I began, picking my words carefully. "You mean to say this old crone I see scuttling around all over the place, sticking her nose in everybody's windows, is the very same," I cried, choking on my laughter. "The very same. But I can see you're not ready to believe a thing, and besides, you got no respect. You young pups think you're so smart with your city ways. Well, you've been told, and now you've been warned. You'll be on your own now, until the matriarch decides what she wants to do with you." Then he stood up and almost ran down the street and back into Drowned Man Shanty. "You expect me to believe this woman is 200 years old?" I yelled after him. I was getting the whim-whams now, and there was no telling what these crazy backwoods types were capable of. Then I got my car and tried to make a break for the inland side, but it was no use. I just sat there, growing more and more ill at ease as the sun faded. I'd be stuck here overnight again, as the tide was already high, and the road was completely impassable. I pondered what possible nefarious airs and spirits possessed this accursed village, and how tidal flats could rise and recede with no more seeming regularity than in obvious response to my desperate need to flee this vile place for more reasonable locales. Once more I turned around, drove back into town, and parked in my usual spot, where I was now accustomed to being watched and closely scrutinized. From there I waited, as once again the sun faded into the rising mists, the barkeep's bell rang loud and clear, and the inmates of Devilskill flooded quietly toward their stone temple for their nightly gathering. No chorus of chants and hymns was carried aloft on the tepid breeze, but the very night itself hovered on the edge of dread expectation. I had to know what lay inside that mysterious tabernacle cloaked in such profound and inimitable silence. So I waited, biding my time. Then I abandoned the car and snuck down the street as silently as I could, clinging to the shadows so no wary straggler could detect my presence. I stood at last before the temple, or whatever purpose it had arisen to fulfill, for church in the usual and accepted sense was absolutely antithetical to this abomination which stood, pride of place, upon a slight rise, keeping watch over the sea. So far I had only seen the place from a distance on my initial reconnaissance through town, not wanting to be discovered encroaching upon what might be some holy of holies, when in truth it was nothing short of a horror of horrors. No light shone from any window to guide the faithful, and I wondered if candles smoked and guttered upon some profane altar to light the communal vespers. I approached a sort of portico that held a sagging roof aloft, but stifled a gasp as I took in the whole of this foreboding structure. The entire surface of the place was encrusted, jewel-like, with the shells, carapaces, fins, and the delicate bony remains of the many and varied creatures of the sea. Lobster claws of all sizes, shapes, and colors were prominently on display, as were the faded shells of crabs, the bony and exquisite housings of mollusks too numerous in kind and variety to name. Great conch horns adorned every window, and the dried leathern fins of great sea carnivores provided the base canvas of this spectacle. But it was the skeletal remains of a mighty prehistoric whale that rose before me as a sort of flying buttress for this uncanny cathedral, the whole of which left me speechless as I gazed up in wonderment at its monstrous and wholly alien beauty. Still, not the slightest murmur nor rustle of feet was heard from within this behemoth, though but a brief half-hour ago
several hundred people had swarmed through its gates and been swallowed into a seeming void. I very gently tried the door handle, relieved to feel it click softly open against the palm of my hand. That door, one of two massive embrasures looming before me in the darkness, opened onto the atmosphere of the tomb. Sliding the door open just enough to squeeze through and press myself against the back wall, I could only hope I remained all but invisible, and the slamming of my heart against my chest did not give me away. As my eyes gradually grew used to the darkness, I detected two tiny flames of light dancing upon a central dais or altar. A pair of standing candles shed just enough light for me to see the whole town poised on their knees before the pulpit. A single figure, its wavering shadow casting ghostly light across the vast stone walls, its arms raised toward the heavens in triumph, or supplication, I could not tell. There were several things about this scene I found utterly abhorrent. The clerical figure triumphant, no fellow of the cloth, was the matriarch, magnificent Marsh, now fully disrobed in all her hideous ancient glory, sagging pendular breasts hanging halfway to her knees, her leathery hide green and wrinkled beyond description, and the huge lidless eyes bulging more defiant than ever. Her complete and unrepentant lack of any kinship with humanity lay on proud display. The whole congregation, the entire village of Devilskill, knelt before her, absolutely naked to the last of them, in their ecstatic adoration of their matriarch, the moans and cries of mindless joy filling the rafters like a hymnal triumphant. My scream went completely unheard in this uproarious exultation. "Rise up before me, my beauteous children, rise up!" Magnificent Marsh croaked in that sibilant mockery of human speech, at once both high-pitched and guttural, a sing-song of the most virulent and accursed cacophony that nearly split my skull in two. "Come unto me now, and be fed," she cried out. What happened next devoured me in horror. The entire congregation rose upon rubbery flapping feet and moved gently, hungrily, as one body over the mottled flesh of magnificent Marsh, as a colony of leeches feeds upon a corpse, those fiendish breasts heaving before the savage ministrations of the communicants. That this ungodly ceremony of the most high obscenity was likely a nightly occurrence caused my consciousness to flee like a terrified child. Somehow I managed to race out into the night like a maddened beast, and then I knew no more. They tell me all this happened 6 weeks ago, and maybe that's true. These last 6 weeks I've sat strapped into this wheelchair, unable to speak, unable to move, not even able to see to the daily ministrations of my flesh that simple human dignity demands. I'm like a living corpse. Save for this, my mind, my memory, and my every thought lays fully intact within me. I am a prisoner of this body as any criminal behind the cold, unyielding bars of his cell, and yet my sobs, my pathetic pleadings for help go unheard in the seeming peace of my reveries. I'm parked now in the sunroom of Miskatonic Hospital's psychiatric wing, where I'm under the excellent care of Dr. Gilman and his dream swimmers, or so they tell me, and maybe that's true as well. Perhaps it is also true that I was discovered lying naked and comatose in the road, near the crossroads between Devilskill and the highway leading to the landward side. But I don't know how I could have possibly gotten there, and my car was still parked in town. Then, as I sit motionless in these pleasant surroundings, something happens for which I'm at a loss to understand. It's Friday afternoon. Dr. Gilman and his colleagues are absent, they say, away in New York City at a conference. Against their expressed orders, there is a visitor to see me in the garden, where I am now being wheeled to await their pleasure. We had just about given up hope of finding any trace of your identity. I know we've got instructions to let no one see you without supervision by Dr. Gilman and his staff, but they're away," the bright young woman chattered on excitedly. "But the doctor will be so pleased," she all but squealed, and I just sat there silently as I always do. The nurse deposited me in the garden and then disappeared, leaving me to wait patiently, for, after all, what else am I to do? "There you are," came that thinly disguised, croaking wheeze. Of course I could not scream, nor call for the nurse to return me to the safety of the sunroom and the company of my fellow inmates. It's time we got you home, don't you think? It was magnificent Marsh, clothed once again in the humble buttoned-up guise of the pious, the simple folk, following the Lord's good example, and tending, if not to the wholesome soil, then to the many and various hidden ways of the sea folk, my kin, my family. And yet, as that horrid beldam wheels me out the front door of the hospital, toward the waiting antiquated buggy and mare, through the silent corridors of my stricken mind, I can hear myself scream and scream and scream.
In His Own Handwriting by S.T. Joshi. 1. Harry had left for the day, given the intense, almost unbearable pain Howard was experiencing. He had scarcely been aware of Harry's presence in the room, and all he could do was give him a weak smile when Harry gently advised him to remember the Greek philosophers. He was referring, of course, to the Stoics, the originators of the stiff upper lip in the face of overwhelming pain, grief, or sorrow. Or was he thinking of the Epicureans, who with equal sense said, "Death is nothing to us. You're either alive or you're not. And once you're dead, you just return to that native infinity of crystal oblivion from which the demon life has called you for one brief and desolate hour." He thought he had written something like that once, long ago, but he now couldn't remember. He knew his time was up. Had known for weeks, perhaps months. Oh, sure, he told his many and far-flung correspondents that he just had indigestion or grippe, that he would be ill for a long time, but would somehow recover to write more stories and lend advice to young and old. But it was a lie, and he knew it. So his life would end before his 47th birthday. Well, Poe was 40 when he died, Mozart 35. His own father had barely reached the age of 53. The memory of him slapping his father across the knees and saying, "Papa, you look just like a young man," suddenly popped irrelevantly into his head. His father had been a dashing young man. No wonder Susie had fallen under his spell. Naive, innocent, and, as he learned later, petrified of sex and physical intimacy. She had probably welcomed Winfield's early demise, loathsome as it was. Where else did the images of putrescent horror in his own tales come from? The door of his cheerless, sterile room opened tentatively, as if the new and unexpected guest wasn't certain he had come to the right place. But the moment Howard caught a glimpse of him, he knew this was no mistake. That balding, roly-poly man who had haunted him all his life, a man whose appearance was so grotesque that it would have evoked laughter in anyone who didn't know who he was and what he stood for, slipped into the room and stood stone-faced at the foot of the bed, plump as Captain Norris and hardly less ominous. What am I afraid of? What can he do to me now? But he sensed, with a sinking of what remained of his spirits, that the demon had one more trick up his sleeve. 2. It wasn't difficult to keep Frank preoccupied. His young, incandescent mind fluttered about from one topic to the next like a crazed butterfly, and all Howard had to do was to give him general instructions to pick out as many Mackin and Dunsany titles as he could find and let him roam in the bookstore where he wished. Howard made it clear that he was determined to spend a good many minutes in the architecture section, knowing that, for all Frank's multifarious interests, the architecture of colonial America was not one of them. When Howard later showed him Singleton's Furniture of Our Forefathers as one of the several books on the subject he had secured, Frank sniffed in disdain and countered with Harper Williams's The Thing in the Woods, the book that he claimed as his reward for helping Howard use up the pestiferous Henneberger's $60 credit at the Scribner bookshop. In his desperate financial condition, Howard had begged the bookstore to convert the credit into cash, but it had refused. Howard didn't know what led him to suspect that the phenomenon he both welcomed and dreaded would happen again, and happen here. Perhaps it was the telltale tingling in his fingers. Perhaps it was nothing more than the fact that it hadn't happened for a good many months, and never in this pest zone. To his friends, his colleagues, his new wife, and especially his devoted but austerely frugal aunts, he had felt an increasing need to prove that his coming to New York was not a mistake. And yet, what did he have to show for the 6 or 7 months he had been here? A few mediocre poems, an article or two for the amateur press, and bootless attempts to secure work through a literary agency, and that criminally expensive New York Times advertisement. Perhaps he should have accepted the editorship of Weird Tales after all, even though it would have meant his moving to the supremely uncolonial wilderness of Chicago. But he had refused, and now that ass Wright was in charge. The architecture shelves were brimming with new titles on matters relating to the colonial era, and Howard took heart at how many people were experiencing a new or revived interest in this field. He himself had only begun his explorations of colonial oases up and down the East Coast. New England he knew well, but he was irked that he hadn't even gotten as far south as the nation's capital, although his honeymoon in Philadelphia, after they had spent the night typing the Houdini manuscript, was invigorating, even if much of it was spent on that rubberneck bus. It was as he was reaching for a copy of Dyer's Early American Craftsman that the roly-poly man materialized as if out of nowhere. It's important to emphasize that Howard did not feel terror, fear, dread, or even apprehension. What he felt most of all was shame. Why can't this man leave me alone? How can I continue living a lie? As on so many previous occasions, the man said nothing, did nothing, or almost nothing. Just the slightest hint of a nod, a beckon, and a swift turn on his heels as he stalked silently off to some remote corner of the bookshop. Howard had to follow. There was really no choice in the matter. The roly-poly man came to a door, one Howard had never noticed before, however many times he had been in this establishment, and drifted right through it. No, that's too preposterous. A trick of the light or some kind of auto-hypnosis. No one believes in ghosts today, do they? The doorknob that Howard clutched spasmodically with his right hand was chilly, but that's natural, isn't it? He opened the door. The roly-poly man was inside, unsmiling as always. He had never seen that expression change. Indeed, could it even be said that the creature had an expression? Wasn't it possible that that face was merely a cunningly devised mask? But that hardly mattered now. The room seemed to be nothing more unusual than a storeroom for excess books, perhaps books that had not yet been catalogued or priced. But the mundanity of the place was not at all reassuring. All these episodes take place in mundane surroundings. It was not the setting that was the source of his terror. No, his shame. It was something else entirely. The roly-poly man, raising his arm with infinite, excruciating slowness, pointed to a high shelf. The symbolism of the gesture struck Howard with a sense of bitter irony. He couldn't possibly feel lower than he did at this moment. It took only the most token glance to see what the man was indicating. Amidst all the books, new or old, dusty or pristine, octavo or folio, was one item that manifestly did not belong. It was the same crumbling brown scrapbook that he had seen so many times before. Howard was tall, a head taller than his unwelcome companion, and he had no difficulty taking the object down. What's the point of looking? I know what is in here. He flipped through the scrapbook, page upon thick page of spidery, almost indecipherable handwriting. Words and sentences leaped out at him, even as he struggled not to read them. From even the greatest of horrors, irony is seldom absent. To Malone, the sense of latent mystery in existence was always present. Back, back, forward, forward. Look, ye puling lackwit. Howard closed the book with a slam, releasing a tiny and derisive cloud of dust. His fingers, then his whole body shook, and he had to reach out with one hand and cling to the tall bookshelf so that he wouldn't collapse in a heap, fainting, just the way I, or someone, made Houdini faint over and over in that pyramid story. When he regained some modicum of self-composure and looked around him, the roly-poly man had disappeared. That was also par for the course. All Howard now knew was that he had more stories to type up and send to Weird Tales. 3. He cast his mind back to the time when he had first seen that roly-poly man. It was a June day in 1917, and he was walking through Swan Point Cemetery with his Aunt Lillian. Suddenly, he saw a crumbling tombstone with a skull and crossbones dimly traced upon its slaty surface. The date, 1711, was still plainly visible. It set him thinking. Here was a link with his favourite era of periwigs, the body of a man who had worn a full-bottomed wig and had perhaps read the original sheets of The Spectator. Here lay a man who had lived in Joseph Addison's day, and who might easily have seen John Dryden had he been in the right part of London at the right time. Why could Howard not talk with him, and enter more intimately into the life of his chosen age? He remembered how his boyhood friends, Harold and Chester and Ronald and Stuart, had laughed at his obsession with the 18th century. "Howard, here we are in a new and dynamic era. You'll never get anywhere if you moon about dwelling in the past. Get a job, get a motor car, get a wife. That's the way to make something of yourself in the world." Maybe it was, but maybe he didn't want to make anything of himself in this fundamentally tawdry age. He was staring off into the distance, thinking of periwigs and small clothes and the coffee shops of London. His yearning for that era sometimes became overwhelming. This must be what it's like to be in love. But no mere female could ever evoke that kind of longing. It was then that he saw the roly-poly man, leaning next to a gaudy marble mausoleum in the distance. "What is it, Howard?" Lillian said. When he made no reply, she repeated the query a little more sharply. "I wonder who that man is," Howard said dreamily. "What man?" Howard couldn't believe it. Lillian's distance vision was usually much better than his own. "Right there," Howard cried, gesturing stiffly. "Howard," Lillian said with some asperity. "There's no one there. Come on, we should be getting along home. You know how your mother worries when you're out too late." Howard looked at her incomprehendingly. There's something wrong here. He was too devoted to reason to think that anything supernatural was occurring, although the tingle in his fingers was certainly anomalous. But he felt an unaccountable desire, no, need, to understand the nature of this situation, and that roly-poly man was at the heart of it. "Just wait a moment. I'll be right back." And before she could protest, he stalked off on his long legs in the direction of the man, who remained motionless and expressionless utterly unconcerned at his rapid approach. Within seconds they stood face to face. Howard looked down at his antagonist. He instinctively thought of him as such, and took heart in the fact that the man was a full head shorter than himself. Howard was not at all used to fisticuffs, although in school he had managed to ward off that bully Monk McCurdy by assuming a dramatically ferocious aspect frightening to the nervous, the "by God I'll kill you" stuff. Why Howard even thought he would have to resort to this sort of behavior he couldn't have begun to explain to himself. But he instinctively sensed that the man was up to no good, so he spoke sharply and aggressively. "Who are you? What are you doing here?" For all Howard knew, the roly-poly man had just as much right to be here as he did. Maybe this mausoleum housed a relative, but somehow Howard knew otherwise. But perhaps his hostile tone would allow him to get to the bottom of the matter before he had to run along home to Mother. All that the roly-poly man did was to gesture faintly, almost imperceptibly, with his head, as if urging Howard to stroll around to the front of the mausoleum. What good would that do? He wondered. Surely he doesn't want to take me inside. It's locked, and I can't believe this fellow has the key. The man himself led the way, as he sensed Howard's reluctance to act on his unspoken command. As they faced the locked, wrought-iron gate that led into the mausoleum, the man only had to nod for the gate to open of its own accord, with a predictable metallic creak. "Very clever bit of prestidigitation, old chap. I don't know how you did that, but you're not going to flummox me with some two-bit sleight of hand." Howard, nevertheless, followed his guide into the place. No, it wasn't dank. The walls weren't covered with nitre. There were no stone steps leading down into the bowels of the earth. It was, in fact, a single narrow room with slabs holding half a dozen or more coffins, expensive and lead-lined, no doubt, with a few empty spaces for additional interments. If anything, the place was dry as dust, and a few cobwebs were festooned in dark corners. Once again, the two men, one short and plump, the other tall and lanky, faced each other. Howard had suddenly lost any sense that a dramatic confrontation would take place. In fact, he now felt a bit foolish. This comical-looking man couldn't possibly be a threat to him. He had no visible weapon of any kind, and his pudgy face and body were the antipodal opposite of threatening. Maybe Howard should just apologize and beat a hasty retreat. But why doesn't he ever speak? As if he had read Howard's mind, the roly-poly man gestured with his head to one of the empty spaces in the room. Howard had, upon his initial entrance into the place, quickly canvassed it for any possible booby-traps or other signs of danger, and had seen nothing. Now, he was almost reluctant to turn his head in the direction of the man's gesture, wondering, in a sudden resurgence of a sense of threat, whether he was trying to distract his attention for nefarious purposes. I think I've read too many dime novels. He felt that a quick look at the empty space couldn't hurt. There had been nothing there before, he had been certain of that, and there could be nothing there now. But there was. It was a crumbling brown scrapbook, large in dimensions, but apparently quite thin, as if holding only a small number of pages. There's some trick here. I must now be very careful. Without letting his eyes leave the man's face, or more properly the top of the man's bald pate, Howard snaked to his right in the direction of the scrapbook. What he expected the scrapbook to be, he couldn't begin to imagine. But once again he sensed the overriding folly of this entire episode, and almost burst out laughing at the grotesquerie of it. Only when he reached the flat marble surface on which the scrapbook rested did he turn his head to give it a hasty examination. It was harmless enough, but he still felt the need to maintain vigilance. He picked up the scrapbook, then quickly turned back to his companion. The roly-poly man had disappeared. Howard was not afraid. Another clever trick, no doubt. Since there was no place the man could have hidden in this solidly built room, He must have slipped away when Howard's attention was focused elsewhere. Well, good riddance to him. I might as well see what my prize in this ridiculous adventure could possibly be. The scrapbook, as he had predicted, had a remarkably small number of pages, perhaps only 15 or 20, but every page was covered from top to bottom with spidery, almost indecipherable handwriting. Only random sentences leaped out at him when he flipped through the pages. In relating the circumstances which have led to my confinement within this refuge for the demented, I am aware that my present position will create a natural doubt of the authenticity of my narrative. I am writing this under an appreciable mental strain, since by tonight I shall be no more. Into the north window of my chamber glows the pole star with uncanny light. The passages sent a shiver through him. This is exactly the kind of work I've wanted all my life to write. With intense embarrassment, he thought of the stories he had written as a child and adolescent, crude, inane, bombastic specimens that his mother had made him save. 2 years earlier, he had said to a friend, "I wish that I could write fiction, but it seems almost an impossibility." It still seemed impossible. And yet this scrapbook contained tales that a Poe, or at least a competent disciple of Poe, could have written. All of a sudden, Howard felt a hot surge of perplexity and nervous apprehension. Now he was grateful that that peculiar man, whoever he was, had so mysteriously vanished, for he did not wish to have any eyewitnesses to his pilfering. He was going to take this scrapbook, read it in his leisure, and then maybe transcribe those stories on his 1906 Remington, and pass them off as his own. It was this final thought that made him flush. I must adhere to the standards of honesty and dignity of my beloved 18th century. But the thirst for literary greatness, even the most fleeting soupçon of recognition, coursed constantly through his mind. My poetry is rubbish. My essays and editorials not much better. What else can I do but establish a foothold in the lowly realm of weird fiction? He made haste to emerge from the mausoleum, hoping Lillian hadn't utterly lost her patience with his tardiness. But as he stumbled out of the place, awkwardly slipping the scrapbook underneath his shirt, he saw her standing patiently by that 1711 gravestone, even if looking a bit sharply in his direction. They walked home in silence. Susie greeted them with a kind of alarmed effusiveness, as if irrationally worried that they would never return. She was, Howard had to confess, starting to get a bit odd. He remembered how Susie had spoken to him about weird and fantastic creatures that rushed out from behind buildings and from corners at dark, and how she shivered and looked about apprehensively as she told her story. Now, she seemed to want to embrace Howard, but he quickly turned his body aside and clumsily embraced her in such a way that she wouldn't feel the scrapbook still stuffed under his shirt. As he read the stories in the solitude of his room, the room he had occupied ever since the family had had to give up his lavish 3-story birthplace in 1904, he did indeed sense a thrill of the supernatural. How could anyone have captured my thoughts, feelings, moods, and images in exactly the language I wish to use, but no, I can't. The tingling that had affected his fingers at the time he saw the scrapbook now seemed to cover his entire frame, and he began to tremble as if in a fit of ague. As he turned the last page, there were indeed only 3 stories, filling 18 stiff cardboard pages. He closed his eyes, expelled an immense sigh, and contemplated the morality of the situation. How can I claim these stories as my own? But if I didn't write them, who did? What violation of natural law has allowed these tales to fall into my hands? He decided to prepare just one of the stories and send it to his new friend, Paul. Paul had the greatest private collection of weird fiction he had ever seen, and he also edited a little amateur magazine where, he had clearly implied, he would be happy to see some of Howard's stories appear. If only I had any stories to send. Howard typed up the story, sent it to Paul. Paul waxed rapturous over it and published it, preceded by a ludicrous paean to his own impending greatness as a writer of weird fiction. 4. And that's how it had begun. At key moments in his life, that roly-poly man would show up, never to be seen by anyone but himself. Every time he would lead him to some obscure, hidden corner, point silently at that same brown scrapbook, same but with different stories each time, and then vanish without a trace. There was the time when he and Clifford, his friend from North Providence, had gone to Arthur Eddy's bookstore downtown. That was when, flipping through the pages, he had come upon sentences that seemed plucked from the innermost recesses of his heart and mind. Unhappy is he to whom the memories of childhood bring only fear and sadness. I have never seen another street as narrow and steep as the Rue d'Essai. Fool that I was to plunge with such unsanctioned frenzy into mysteries no man was meant to penetrate. History, indeed, was all I had, after everything else ended in mocking Satanism. And every time he dutifully typed up those stories, affixing his name to them, sending them out to publishers, amateur and professional, as his own. The frequency of the act did not make it any easier, did not lessen the sense of guilt and shame that he was absconding with the work of some other man, brashly claiming credit that belonged to another. Once he was wandering among the stacks of the John Carter Brown Library, looking for rare tomes on antiquarian Americana that could not be found even in the main student library at Brown. He had once hoped to matriculate to Brown, but illness and nerves had gotten the better of him, and he had to be content to be a non-university barbarian and alien. But that telltale tingling in the fingers came again, and the roly-poly man this time actually touched the scrapbook, on a high shelf he could reach only by absurdly standing on a chair. Why aren't the librarians making a fuss? And giving him that balefully significant look. Curse you, Thornton. I'll teach you to faint at what my family do. Carter, it was the unnameable. It was the Yuletide, that men call Christmas, though they know in their hearts it is older than Bethlehem and Babylon, older than Memphis and mankind. Then had come the move to New York. Sonia had been as kind and wonderful as a wife could be, but it had all been a mistake. His fleeing back to Providence like a dog with its tail between his legs had been undignified, but necessary for the very salvation of his mind and spirit. But he knew that, just as that roly-poly man had followed him to the metropolis, he would inevitably make his way back to this New England backwater, the only place he could consider home. The most merciful thing in the world, I think, is the inability of the human mind to correlate all its contents. But by God, Eliot, it was a photograph from life. In the morning, mist comes up from the sea by the cliffs beyond Kingsport. West of Arkham, the hills rise wild, and there are valleys with deep woods that no axe has ever cut. His illegitimate, undeserved fame, if indeed it could be called that, was growing. New friends, fellow writers of weird fiction, August, Donald, Two Gun, wanted to make his acquaintance. Even book publishers expressed some faint interest. Was it because he knew those stories really weren't his that he spoke so modestly, even disparagingly of them? When a traveller in north-central Massachusetts takes the wrong fork at the junction of the Aylesbury Pike just beyond Dean's Corners, he comes upon a lonely and curious country. In later years, the scrapbook, brown and crumbling as always, at times attained immense thickness, filling dozens, perhaps hundreds of pages. He couldn't imagine how it even stayed in one piece. Some of the stories were so long it took him weeks, months to type them. He couldn't imagine the effort it must have taken to write them. Certainly, that was well beyond his own capacities. Bear in mind closely that I did not see any actual visual horror at the end. Sometimes he would be so mortified at this literary theft that he hid the scrapbook behind bookshelves, under cabinets,
once between the mattresses of his bed. As the years progressed, he could only bring himself to send out a single story in a whole year. No one can accuse me of profiting from another man's work, can they? I am forced into speech because men of science have refused to follow my advice without knowing why. And in that lair of the deep ones we shall dwell amidst wonder and glory forever. What they finally found inside Edward's oddly assorted clothes was mostly liquescent horror. They were, instead, the letters of our familiar alphabet, spelling out the words of the English language in my own handwriting. I am it, and it is I. And then he was stricken. He held off going to the doctor as long as possible, but finally his Aunt Annie had summoned Dr. Dustin, who in turn had called in a specialist, Dr. Leet. But by then it was too late. Howard was dying. 5. Why have you come? He had no idea why he was even speaking to the roly-poly man, the man who had never spoken a word to him. That blank, deadpan face, maybe a mask, should have been terrifying, but he was now beyond the reach of fear or joy, dread or ecstasy. There was only the intense, almost unbearable pain. What do you want with me? He could barely get the words out, but he felt the need for some kind of final confrontation with this creature, this source and focus of all his shame and mortification. Why had this man harried him all his adult life? What had he done to deserve it? Without warning, the man's figure began to blur, change, transform, and in a matter of seconds there stood before him a tall, slim figure with the young face of an antique pharaoh, gay with prismatic robes and crowned with a golden pskent that glowed with inherent light. But somehow there was no terror here, only a transcendent awe and wonder. Howard took the spectacular metamorphosis in stride, but what truly stunned him was that words at long last began to pour forth from the entity's mouth. You have reached the end, he or it said. The statement was uttered with an ineffable mildness, as of the peace that surpasseth all understanding. It was only a confirmation of what Howard already knew, but the words nonetheless carried a blissful finality that comforted, soothed, reassured. I know, Howard managed to say in a whisper. I just wish... Wish what? The figure queried. Howard paused for many moments. For some strange reason, he did not wish to annoy or alienate his companion. All he wanted was an explanation. Why have you done what you have done? The figure turned his head to one side, as if in query. What have I done? Howard couldn't believe he would have to explain what to him was so obvious. At the same time, he sensed that even a mildly accusatory tone or implication would be problematical, even dangerous. You tempted me. You made me pass off the work of another as my own. You knew I could not resist the urge to see my name in print, plastered over tales that I could not possibly have written. Why did you do that? Why? The speech exhausted him, and he no longer cared what repercussions his words might have on his antagonist. He had, after all, reached the end. But to his surprise, the figure did nothing but smile. He was, Howard sensed, enjoying a secret joke, a joke of such cosmic hilarity that the stars could not encompass it. I made you claim the work of another? Who? Who is this other you speak of? I don't know, Howard cried out in a final burst of strength. The scrapbook, the writing, not mine. Not yours? Then whose? Who else could have written those stories but you? Who else had the imagination, the learning, the grasp of the physiology of fear to set those tales down? It was you, no one but you. You found that scrapbook on your own. I only led you to it, time and time again.
It was in your dreams that you found that book, found that spidery, almost indecipherable writing. That writing came from your heart, your mind, your soul, no one else's. I know, for I am Nyarlathotep, the crawling chaos. And with that, the figure gathered up the folds of his robe, made a curious gesture with his right hand, and vanished from the room in a blaze of light and a flurry of wind. And, as he died, Howard Phillips Lovecraft knew at last that his life had not been lived in vain.
The Green Door by Ian Gordon. 1. Email sent to Christian Michael Pickles, 32-year-old office worker, resident of Manchester. Chris, there's a green door, and I'm going to tell you all about it. You might wonder why I'm emailing you specifically, but there's no reason in particular. Well, aside from your reputation as one of the good guys. Ha! To be honest, I've got myself into a bit of a pickle. No pun intended. I noticed something, and I wish I hadn't. It's not looking too good for me. And to think the whole thing got started on the bloody tram. You know what it's like when you catch the tram. It's crowded, seats are more or less impossible to come by, and you spend the majority of the journey looking out of the window because, God forbid, you make eye contact with someone. Your eyes are glued to the world outside, the hustle and bustle of the city, the towering buildings, the traffic jams. And though you see all this stuff, you're not really looking. The odd thing might catch your eye, something designed to catch your eye, a billboard or whatever, but you're not in the business of committing any of it to memory. Not usually, anyway. Well, I'd probably caught that tram 1,000 times, but never once had I noticed the door. I mean, I must have seen it. It's hardly possible not to have seen it, given its location. But that morning, just a few weeks ago now, was the first time I really saw it. On the surface, it was just a regular door, off Moseley Street, set back a bit between two office blocks. But there was something about it that drew my attention. There are probably a million things like that in life, things we see in passing but never notice. The big house at the end of the street, the lone tree on the hill overlooking the cemetery, the ghastly gargoyle above the window. For some reason, certain things just refuse to register, until that moment finally comes along, that mysterious flash of awareness. It's almost as though these things happen by design. Well, it must have been a day or two after I first noticed the door that I found myself walking down Moseley Street on the lookout for a taxi. I'd been out with Gary Chadderton in the Northern Quarter, supping in some bar or other that I can't for the life of me recall the name of now. It was that time of the night, between 2 and 3 in the morning, and it was ridiculously quiet. I hate it when it's like that, because you can sense the opportunistic glares of wrong-uns at the corner of every poorly lit street. Fortunately, though, it didn't look like anybody was out to get me that night, so it was with a misplaced sense of confidence that I slipped off the main road to answer the call of nature. I'm sure you can guess where I ended up. I stumbled into that recess I mentioned, and came face to face with the green door. It was unusual. Looked like it shouldn't really be there. The sort of opening you'd expect to lead into an alley or something. But there was just the door back there at the bottom of a hefty brick building that soared as high as its concrete neighbours. It was a decent size, at least 8 feet in height, I'd say, and about 5 feet wide, and dark green in colour, like moss, a bit tarnished in places. The main thing to note, though, is that it lacked a handle, and there appeared to be no conceivable way to open it, which, as I stood there that night polluting the wall next to it, suggested to me that it was some sort of fire door,
not meant to be accessed externally. Anyway, I'd done what I needed to do and had returned to Mosley Street when, after another 50 paces or so towards St. Peter's Square, I heard a shocking squeal behind me. On the instant, I spun around and squinted hard. There was something back there, right in the middle of the road, a massive shadow shape, towering over a much smaller shape beneath it. Whatever the larger of the two was, it was feeding on the smaller one, tearing at it with unseen teeth, like a giant bear devouring a squirming salmon. The squeal sounded again, and was followed by a grisly chewing noise, a truly horrible racket that my reluctant brain refused to interpret. And all this I saw in black and white, the monster, the victim, even the fluids that were expelled from the latter, all oddly silhouetted. I'd seen enough. I turned to run, but not before the massive shadow shape leapt into the air and plunged into the niche from which I'd only seconds ago emerged, the recess with the door. And although something lay in the road, broken and bleeding, living or dead, I couldn't possibly be sure. I took off at a rate of knots, ran home in the end. The next day, Friday morning it was, I boarded the tram nervously. I felt rough as hell, and had considered pulling a sickie, but the part of me that wanted to know whether I'd imagined the previous night's events or not gave me just enough energy to get up out of bed and dress for work. The tram arrived at St. Peter's Square, and I stuck my head against the window, craning to get a glimpse of what might be ahead on Mosley Street. I expected there to be some sort of closure, a diversion perhaps, but this wasn't the case. As a matter of course, the tram flew up the road and reached Piccadilly Gardens without incident. Still curious, but still doubting the reality of my experience, I alighted at Piccadilly and retraced my steps from the night before. But there was nothing to be seen in the middle of the road. Of course there wasn't. The tram would have splattered to oblivion anything that happened to be spread across the tracks. In fact, there was no evidence whatsoever of what I'd watched by the light of a dozen street lamps. Had the creature returned for the remains of its quarry? Had the rain washed the victim's fluids away? As far as I was aware, there hadn't been any rain in the city for several weeks. I entered the narrow recess and approached the tarnished door, still on the lookout for evidence of foul play. There was a horrible stench back there, a real nasty stink that I can't compare to anything. You know that smell that sometimes wafts up from mucky grids at the height of summer? Well, it was like that, but as though the gunk had been reduced down to intensify its unpleasantness. I reckon members of the deep-sea community smell like that when left to rot in the sun. I think it was right then, just as I took my umpteenth lungful of that stink, that my obsession with the green door began. As I said, there was no obvious way to open it, but I figured there had to be another way into the building. After all, it was connected on both sides by perfectly ordinary-looking office blocks. So, having pulled that belated sickie, I made my way round to West Mosley Street, on the lookout for a back entrance. Easier said than done. I couldn't even find the back of the building, let alone a door through which to access it. My phone was no help either. The area, as captured by satellite, was indistinct. It looked as though it had been purposely altered. I mean, the neighbouring office blocks were visible, but the recess section appeared as a tight alleyway connecting Mosley to West Mosley. Didn't I say that the building looked like it shouldn't really be there? I started to question my sanity. You just do, don't you? When things get weird and stay weird, what else can you do? Feeling properly perplexed, I went down to Cooper Street to grab a cup of coffee from the good people at the Bruintists. I fancied myself some spanakopita, but the spinach filling reminded me of the green door, or rather the massive shadow shape as it scoffed the smaller thing in the road. I skipped food altogether. Ordering my drink, I made no mention of the door. I sat by the window and sipped away, contemplating a variety of schemes. Perhaps I could enter the lobby of one of the office blocks next to the mysterious building and find a way to gain access to it. I might be able to convince an employee to give me a tour of the basement or show me a way up to the roof. Yeah, right. I soon gave up on the infiltration idea. I'd come up against a stony-faced security guard, and I'd crumble like a short-crust apple pie. So instead, tail between my legs, I took myself home, determined to come up with something more feasible. I spent the remainder of the day on the internet, scanning endless aerial maps of central Manchester, looking in vain for the tall, narrow structure that sat between those two office blocks, the structure host to the green door, the door behind which something nasty lurked, a thing that came out at night to feed. But it wasn't there, wasn't on any of the maps, wasn't mentioned in any of the literature. Sat at home in front of the computer, I started to feel like the whole thing had happened in my imagination. I mean, that's how it goes, isn't it? Once you're away from it all in a familiar environment, it's almost as though the strangeness evaporates. It very quickly becomes conceivable that what you thought you saw was all in your head. That, in my case, the only thing between those office blocks on Moseley Street was empty space, an inconsequential alley separating two buildings. But I'm not an idiot, and I had no cause to think that I'd lost my marbles. So I pressed on with my research, ineffective though it was proving to be. And when the internet offered absolutely jack diddley to support my cause, I took the search back to the city. Saturday morning, I went back to the scene of the crime and pondered the door some more. The city centre was far from quiet. In fact, a continuous stream of people passed the recess as I stood there, studying the door's tarnished surface with a critical eye. It looked to me as though it had been there for a very long time, half a century or more, and had undoubtedly been opened more times than I could guess, as, on the cold ground beneath my feet, I saw a number of light grooves in the stone, where the door, heavy and metallic, had scored it over decades of use. Done with simply looking at it, I put my ear up against it, listening for evidence of anything at all on the other side. But what a pointless exercise that proved to be, surrounded by the din of the city. It was about then, though, straining to hear, that I became aware of a presence behind me. Exactly when this stealthy individual had appeared, I hadn't a clue. But there he was, a homeless man evidently, poorly dressed and looking a bit rough round the edges. "Can I help you?" I asked, moving away from the door, slightly embarrassed. "I don't know," he replied. "Can you?" His voice was thick with phlegm, his eyes were bloodshot, and his nose looked like a shiny red bauble. "I don't know," I said, echoing his words. "What do you want?" "I want to help you," he said, echoing mine. "With what?" "That door," he said, motioning towards the object of my fascination. "What about it?" "I know what's on the other side." And with that, he had my interest. "Okay," I said, nodding. "What'll it cost me?" "I don't know," he said again, scratching the wisp of hair atop his grimy head. "A tenner?" "A pretty reasonable price, I thought." "It's a deal," I said. I extracted 2 fivers from my wallet and handed them to him. "This way," he said, snatching the cash eagerly. And off we went. Not a word was exchanged on the way to wherever he was leading me. I just followed dutifully, finding myself intrigued by his unusual proposition. You might wonder what possessed me to get involved with him in the first place. It was that bloody door, I tell you. Somehow or other, after following a ridiculously circuitous route, we ended up in Sackville Gardens, where a group of the man's friends sat on a grotty bench overlooking the canal. I was invited to join them, and I have to tell you was pleasantly surprised at the courtesy thrown my way by this band of unfortunate down-and-outs. There were 5 of them in all, 3 of which looked a little out of it, but I wasn't about to pass judgment. The man I'd given 10 quid introduced himself as Phil, before referring me to a bulky and intimidating chap by the name of Nige. Demeanour aside, Nige seemed with it, as far as I could tell, and had the look of one who was used to telling stories, a dramatic air that emanated from his dark complexion and waist-length dreadlocks. His face was as round as a football, with a huge scar carved into his right cheek. "What have you got for me?" he asked, eyeballing Phil, but I immediately realised that the question was for my benefit.
The cash I'd handed to his underling was essentially a down payment. 40 quid, I offered, feeling generous, but also weirdly anxious to hear what the man had to say. Nige nodded and held out a vast, calloused hand. I parted with 2 20s and accepted the man's invitation to sit next to him on the bench. "Come at night," he began, stuffing the notes into an engorged jacket pocket. "Not every night, but when there be feeding to be done. You see, those things get real hungry down there, living off moss and ferns. Gotta come out when they can to get 'em calories. Do you know what I mean?" I shook my head. I hadn't a clue what he meant. "You heard of 'em froggers?" he continued. "Them who live in others' houses without 'em knowing?" I nodded. "I don't know about you, but where I grew up, frogging was the stuff of urban legend. Used to scare your school friends at lunchtime." "Plenty of froggers in the city," Nige said, looking up at the surrounding buildings, particularly the vacant-looking windows belonging to the upper floors. "We know some of 'em, but them who live on the other side of the green door, they be the original froggers. Froggers before frogging was a thing." There's a short story, I recalled then, by John Collier, about a man who rejects society and moves into the shadows of a department store. He soon learns that he's not the only person to have done so, and becomes an unwitting member of a very unusual hidden society. I wondered, was this the kind of frogging Big Nige was referring to? "You seen 'em, yeah?" he said. "I saw something," I said. "How did you know?" "You've seen the door. Once you've seen the door, they follow." "I don't know what I saw," I said, shaking my head. "But it wasn't human." "No humans down there," Nige stated definitively, and laughed, revealing a surprisingly impressive set of straight, white teeth. I shuddered. The man was leering at me. "Listen," he said, leaning into me. "If you've seen 'em, they've seen you. Do you know what I mean?" Again I shook my head. "Do what we do," he went on, "and stay away from that door." And with those words, the atmosphere changed. Nige had said all he meant to say, and, by the way he turned his back to me on the bench, seemed to want to get back to whatever it was he did all day, down there by the canal. But as I turned to leave, a little mystified, he barked something over his shoulder that for some reason I can still recall with perfect clarity. I'll do my best to type it out phonetically. "Ya, Cthulhu Mythos." It made the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. Felt like a hex or something. But now, knowing what I know, I'm sure it was a warning. That night, my dreams were strange. More colour than anything else, in stark contrast to the monochromatic madness I'd seen on Mosley Street, with big shapes floating through dark passageways, merging to form hazy, iridescent clouds. Somehow these clouds were after me, looking for a way out of the tunnels, and, like steam forcing its way out of a boiling pan, the things were funneled upwards towards the green door, where they shot out into the night, unhindered, seeking sustenance in the form of my tender flesh. I'm pleased to report that I awoke before those things caught up with me, but the memory of weird, misty faces seemed to linger at the forefront of my mind. Faces beyond description, but faces nonetheless. If things like that came for me in the waking world, I doubt I'd be able to pluck up the will to outrun them. They were all mouth and teeth, mindlessly chomping like vaporous crocodiles. Then the words of the homeless giant, Nige, came back to me. "Gotta come out when they can to get 'em calories. Do you know what I mean?" 2. Sunday. Oddly refreshed and not at all discouraged by the memory of my encounter with the man with the waist-length dreadlocks, I made my way back into town, hungry for more. I'd read of a bookshop on Tib Street, one of those traditional places stocked full of rare and out-of-print volumes. Though the internet is unquestionably an excellent source of information, it's a digital source, meaning that, as I know only too well doing what I do for a living, it's vulnerable to tampering. Much better to adopt a boots-on-the-ground approach if you're after an accurate view of the world. And what a place that is on Tib Street. It's a time capsule, looking like a set from a Hammer horror film or something. Well, there I was, wandering up and down the aisles, left to my own devices, which, for a socially challenged individual such as myself, is always a blessed relief. To be honest, I wasn't really sure what I was looking for. Perhaps something on the history of the city, something that might have been printed back in the pre-internet days, with mention of Mosley Street, something to corroborate the vagaries of the big man, Nige. The girl at the desk, a pleasant young lady with the most striking eyes I've ever seen, pointed me towards the local history section, where I immediately found something of interest, a book titled The Floor Below. First published in 1974, and written by a Mancunian called Robert Short, the book deals with hidden Manchester, a network of interconnected spaces, tunnels and waterways that exist beneath the city centre. A quick flick through the book convinced me to buy it, because there was a map in there that seemed to show what I was looking for, the brick building between the office blocks on Mosley Street. Now, I could go on and on about the floor below and hidden Manchester, but let me see if I can provide a brief overview. These underground places, toilets, bunkers, even shops, accessible from various locations across the city, fascinating though they might be, are generally considered to be unsafe. There are numerous hazards below ground, a lack of light, poor air quality, rotten timbers over pits, dangerous debris, you name it. And so, aside from the authorities, few people venture underground, and those that do tend to know what they're doing. Even those who go down there unofficially, photographers, urban explorers and the like. After all, nobody wants to lose their way. But the key thing to keep in mind is this. Manchester's underground labyrinth has never been officially mapped. Subterranean development has been going on for centuries. So, according to Robert Short, it's inevitable that many projects, particularly abandoned projects, were never properly documented. But this is just the tip of the iceberg. As I went to pay for the book, another character emerged from the bowels of the shop, presumably the owner. I'm guessing here, but he just had that look about him. An older gent in a thick turtleneck, with the thickest Lancastrian accent I've ever heard. "So, you've an interest in the underground, eh?" he asked as I pulled my wallet out. "I'm just getting into it," I said. "Not thinking of heading down there yourself, are you?" I hesitated, and the chap seemed to notice. "Well," he said, "if you are thinking of taking a plunge, there's another book you might want to take a look at." From somewhere behind the scenes, he produced this other book, a tatty-looking thing it was, unimpressive. "It's yours," the man said, nodding thoughtfully, eyeing his colleague. I paid for the floor below and left the place, making my way to another favoured spot of mine, Jackie's Corner on Stevenson Square. There, over at least half a dozen flat whites, I skimmed through my purchases, including that stuff I just told you about hidden Manchester. The other book, the author of which seems to be uncredited, is a book called One Fearful Eye. It's here with me as I speak. It describes a hidden society that was rumoured to live in the spaces and tunnels under Manchester, a society that rejected the world above ground. Remember the John Collier story I mentioned? Seems my old friend Nige was at the very least well read. The book suggests that, as the authorities continued to develop the city's subterranean spaces, the society grew fearful of incursion and burrowed deeper underground in order to remain hidden. However, these extreme measures only intensified their fear and paranoia, making them vulnerable to an altogether different kind of intrusion, invasion of the mind. Deeper still, the book continues, miles below the surface, where dark caverns give way to bottomless pits, an ancient being resides, a nameless creature said to be older than mankind. Weakened by their exhaustive digging efforts, the hidden society was said to be targeted by this thing. It came to them in dreams, a huge, swirling mass of a nature impossible to describe. Remind you of something? Over the course of several years, this vaporous monster corrupted the minds of the subterranean dwellers, transforming them into entities like itself, using them, in effect, as vessels to reach the surface, to provide access to mankind, to satisfy a strange and unfathomable hunger. Pretty weird, or what? There are indications throughout the book that the author was once a member of the hidden society, but who can say? Honestly speaking, the book reads like fiction. But fiction or not, it convinced me that the Green Door was one of several entrances to the subterranean world of that doomed society, and I found myself more eager than ever to find a way to open it. Absolutely ridiculous, I know, but there was no stopping me. The tap of curiosity was in full flow, and the handle had come off. So I went back there, without a plan, and gazed at the door, for hours I reckon, wondering how I might overcome my nemesis. Then I spotted the manhole. Whether it had been there before or not, I hadn't a clue, but it hardly mattered because it seemed to present a solution to the problem at hand. But I wasn't getting that thing open without help. So, under a sky turning steadily violet, I crossed the busy city centre in the direction of Sackville Gardens. Perhaps my new homeless friends would know of a reliable method to open a manhole. Why I thought they'd assist me, I don't know, especially after the big man's verbal warning. But I wandered over anyway, keeping to the quieter streets wherever possible. On reaching the park, I was surprised to see that it was all but deserted, with the exception of a few mindless bench-sitters here and there, their square eyes glued to smartphones. They wouldn't have been aware of my presence if I'd arrived by helicopter. But when I went to Nigel's bench, the grotty bench overlooking the canal, I found the remains of a small fire smouldering on the stony ground in front of it. Bits of charred paper were dotted about, and here and there odd-looking puddles of a dark, thick liquid. There was a stench in the air, faint but familiar. The stink I'd detected down by the green door, that indefinable smell that reminded me of mucky grids in summer. What the hell was I getting myself into? On the bench, freshly carved into the wood, was a single word, Azoth. I would later look the term up, and found the following description online. Azoth is a term with roots in alchemy, representing a universal solvent, or a substance thought to have the power to transform and perfect all matter, including the human soul and body. It was believed to be the essential agent of transformation, akin to the Philosopher's Stone. In esoteric traditions, Azoth often refers to a spiritual force or the ultimate source of life, unifying all opposites and enabling the attainment of enlightenment or immortality. I suspect that Azoth, whatever it is, has something to do with the supposed ancient thing spoken of in One Fearful Eye. Perhaps it has access to or control over this substance, and uses it to carry out its terrible transformations. Just a theory. But theory or not, I wish I'd looked it up before continuing with my plan to open that manhole. I left Sackville Gardens with the nagging impression that something awful had happened to Nige and his cohorts, something connected to their knowledge of whatever lurked behind that green door. Dusk was all about now, setting my teeth on edge. The streets were intimidating, filled with glaring strangers, all of whom seemed to know what I was up to, where I was going, what I wanted to do when I got there. Twice I had to duck out of sight, convinced that I was being followed, but the surface dwellers of Manchester were the least of my concerns, when, at last, I arrived at that shadowy recess off Mosley Street, and came face to face with an open door. I say open, but it was only just open, providing a pathetic glimpse of what lay on the other side. But it wasn't darkness, the gloom of nighted vaults. No, an eerie light shone from within, an iridescent glow that compelled me to approach. I edged forward in an effort to keep my wits about me, but I could sense that I was losing awareness, overwhelmed as I was by curiosity. That nasty odour once again filled my nostrils, but it didn't deter me, nor did the low drone that seemed to emanate from the door, the monotonous, continuous hum of an alien voice calling to me. My heart beating in my chest, I reached out and clutched the cold metal, momentarily startled by the iciness of it. I pulled the door open, winced as it scraped across the hard ground, and froze. Nothing shocking met my gaze, nothing monstrous, just the light, the strange, iridescent glow that had substance, and to my unflinching eyes whirled and pulsed like the beating of a massive, vaporous heart. And as I watched, unable to move, faces appeared in the cloud, faces strange and faces familiar, as though, it seemed to me, the intelligence at the back of the phenomenon was trying to communicate with me. But something was terribly wrong. Every nerve and fibre screamed it, and so I tried to look away. It took one hell of an effort to do so, but I managed it. And as I did, my gaze falling to the ground, I saw wisps of vapour, like feelers caressing my ankles, and on seeing them, I was instantly overwhelmed by a terrible burning sensation. I cried out then, the reality of the situation crashing down on me like a toppled chimney stack. Everything was clear, black and white, just as it had been that very first night, and from out of the green door sprang that monstrous shadow shape, a mass of whirling members, probing with the desperation of a drowning man. How I avoided it, I haven't a clue, but somehow I did, narrowly escaping its groping appendages. Out onto Mosley Street I ran, wailing like a banshee, passing dozens of people, all of them glaring at me bewilderedly, like I was a lunatic loosed from bondage. And that shadow shape came over the top of them, leaping one moment, flowing the next, a bundle of disparate components pieced together by a disordered mind. But the people on the street were blind to it, or so it seemed, because not a single one of them looked as it swept by, spilling its dark, sticky fluids and giving off that mortuary stench. But after a short while it gave up the chase and left me to run hell for leather into the night, not really caring where I ended up. Why it did so, I don't know, because it was practically on top of me and could have easily overpowered me. I'm not sure what time it was, but I found myself slumped against a wall somewhere under the Castlefield Viaduct. I think I'd drifted off and woke up again before I realised where I was. My head was killing me, and the moss under my backside was damp. But I was alone, thank God. My ankles were stinging, but I'd worry about that when I got home. I limped back. It took me about 2 hours. Went straight to bed, fully clothed. When I finally came round, it was after lunchtime. The sound of rain above me on the roof window reminded me that I desperately needed a shower. Then, thinking of my ankles, I opted for a bath instead. Jesus, what a mess. They looked as though I'd been wearing tight shackles for the last couple of years. A coldish bath took the edge off, and afterwards I applied antiseptic and bandaged them. Feeling a little disorientated and not at all myself, I went back to bed and slept straight through to the following morning, a dreamless slumber at that. What day would that have been? I've lost track. Well, suffice it to say that when I climbed out of bed that morning, physically shattered and worried about my throbbing ankles, I decided to stay at home. No more jaunts into Manchester for a couple of days. Besides, the last thing I wanted to see was that door. I had no desire whatsoever to run into that thing again. But as I went about my domestic chores that morning, I came across the copy of One Fearful Eye stuffed into a trouser pocket. Something compelled me to turn to page 57, a chapter intriguingly titled The Mark. The following passage chilled me to the bone. It, the ancient thing, approaches its chosen victim where the boundaries between worlds are thin, perhaps deep within a cave or near volcanic vents. It reaches out with hands of swirling smoke, brushing against its victim's skin. Where the smoke touches, the skin begins to darken as though bruised, but the marks take on intricate patterns. Over time, the smoke marks spread beneath the skin. Veins turn black, and in some instances, victims begin to exhale faint wisps of smoke. As the markings spread, flesh becomes translucent. In the final stage, the smoke marks completely envelop the victim. Flesh becomes immaterial, dissolving into thick, swirling clouds of vapor. The suggestion of a face glows faintly within the mist, and what passes for speech is now but a low drone on the wind. They are no longer human. Driven by primal urges, their will is under the influence of the creature that marked them. So, there you have it. I'm marked. In time, I'll become one of them. A few days later, I went into the city one last time, hobbled to and from the tram, made my way to Moseley Street, looking for the green door. Well, wouldn't you believe it? It wasn't there. No door, no brick building, just an indistinct alleyway connecting Moseley to West Moseley. I ambled over to Sackville Gardens. Nothing carved on that grubby bench. I'd have visited the bookshop again, to ask the owner what he knew about the author of One Fearful Eye, but I'd gone as far as my sore ankles could carry me. It took every ounce of energy left in me to make it back to the tram stop at St. Peter's Square. And that's it. Everything I know about the green door, and what lurks behind it. And yes, I'm talking about it in the present tense, because I know it's there. Has to be there on some plane or other. Now, though, as I sit here, ailing, I can't help but theorize. Why did I see it in the first place? It's like there's a fisherman out there, casting his line, baiting his catch. All he needs to do is show you the door, and your curiosity does the rest. What's the point, though? Why does it do what it does? Do I really have to find out? My dreams are wild, much the same as they were the other week, though now I'm one of the shadow shapes, forced to dwell underground, a servitor of the Ancient One, the thing without a name. The change is coming, Chris. I can feel it. Something in my chest. It's all wrong. Don't bother replying. I won't be here to respond. But I had to tell someone. Had to warn someone. If you see that green door, well, I reckon you'll know what to do. All the best. Rick. Mr. Pickles, considering the email a prank or work of fiction, chose not to respond to his friend and former colleague, Richard Taylor. A short while later, Mr. Taylor's family reported him missing. No evidence concerning his disappearance was uncovered at his flat in Stretford, though over 200 sketches of the green door found inside indicated that he had indeed established an unhealthy obsession with it. Some left-field investigators have suggested that scorch marks found on the bathroom wall forming the outline of a door are proof of Mr. Taylor's transformation and subsequent descent into the depths of hidden Manchester. Officials, however, strongly oppose this view. A Church Within a Church by Paul Draper. How in my weakness can my hopes depend? On one lone God, though mighty be his power. Why can Jove's host no more assistance lend, to soothe my pain and cheer my troubled hour? To the Old Pagan Religion by H.P. Lovecraft. 1. A Grey Morning.
I need to think. It was a grey morning. We pulled into All Saints' Church at Anchester just after dawn. I recall this particular renovation wasn't straightforward, but my memories have been hazy since we finished, so I'll just think it through, and the details should become clear. There was a low haze, the sun barely breaching the banks of mist. I remember parking the van and having to stretch out my right shoulder after the drive. For some reason it had been irritating me. Perhaps I had slept awkwardly. I was with the full Hughes Renovators team, as I recall. Myself, Gordon Hughes, and my big son Jack, wearing his signature parka coat, of course, and our wiry veteran all-rounder Derek Castle in his old overalls. Derek is the most experienced in listed building work. He comes from a local line of builders and restorers. His grandfather worked on the ill-fated Exham Priory restoration nearly 100 years ago, which was struck by disaster when the client, a Mr. Delapour, went insane and murdered an associate during the work. We were the initial team. Once the first couple of days' preparatory work was completed, my wider local group would arrive to help get through the bulk of it. I was happy to be carrying out this new project so close to my home. Being able to see Alice at the end of working days was always the best arrangement. It's easy to become strangers in a marriage when you're away for long contracts. All Saints' Church was an atmospheric sight from the get-go. A rotting notice board, long pair of announcements, stood by an ornately carved, probably 15th century lychgate that led from the parking area through to the churchyard, where headstones of varying ages leaned back and forth amongst the overgrown grass. An old yew tree, common in so many English churchyards, spread its branches out majestically above the graves. As arranged, the lady from the church's National Council waited by the studded oak door at the porch. Hannah? Yes, that was her name. She was to be present through the work as the client contact and to provide opinions on any issues we revealed. It was good to finally meet her. She was unassuming, but I do remember she had intense green eyes that thoroughly scanned us as she bade us welcome. Pleasantries out of the way, we stepped through the door with our tools and entered the church. 2. The First Church. The route to the contract had ultimately been quite simple once we had got past the labyrinthine complications placed in the way of it by the Church of England. I'd been on the odd local job for farming and haulage buildings the previous year. Quite simple work, easily handled between Derek and I, which was just as well, with Jack frequently away with his diving and climbing. I'd almost forgotten we had written to the county council, inquiring about the All Saints renovation a couple of years prior as part of a general outreach regarding any likely work so close to our doorstep. It turned out that planning application for a complete renovation had been submitted to the diocese several years ago, and been bogged down in first the approval process and then finance issues at Anchester's Parochial Church Council, or PCC as it's known. The PCC was governed by measures from the Church of England, and its wheels turned so slowly, the second coming seemed more likely to occur first. When Jack returned from his scuba trip to America, he seemed intent on focusing on work. Perhaps that was enough adventure for 1 year, even for him. He was particularly interested in working on the All Saints job. Public discontentment was gaining pace, with a pressure group called the Friends of All Saints frequenting local newspapers. The lobby group claimed they had grant applications in flight and could work to raise money to restore the church. I must say I was so proud to learn that Jack had handled liaising with our architect network and pushed for faculty approval of the subsequent plans all by his own initiative, only bringing it to me once it looked like a genuine prospect. All Saints was a typical Grade 1 listed place of worship in the county, albeit a neglected one. Raised in the 14th century in the Perpendicular Gothic style, its primary material was flint, which at some point was rendered in a vaguely uncomely concrete. At the west end, a castellated tower with a solitary 18th century bell was propped by diagonal buttresses, giving it a classic English rural look. The congregation had dwindled over the decades, as with many across England, but the proposal in the renovation was to refresh the place and return it to a thriving community centre. The aim would be to not only revive worship, but provide an additional income as a venue for civic meetings and shows. As we stood in the atrium by the door, it was easy to see the grandeur that this building projected in the local community through the ages. Under the vaulted ceiling, the interior sported some unique stone canopies dating from that period, nestling under which were tombs of various regional nobles. A particularly striking one against the north wall was clearly an Easter sepulchre, a switch of service point for that holy time of year. The atrium still sported its original 14th century font, which was to be covered and then cleaned by a separate team once we'd finished the heavy work. The stained glass was accomplished 19th century artisanship, according to the church's plans. One glaring difference was a rather tasteless millennium window by the north aisle, installed just before the church fell into disuse. The difference in craftsmanship with the older work was sadly obvious. Other features dotted around the interior were a large doom painting showing the Last Judgment, assorted memorial stonework and carvings, 2 gaudy aristocratic hatchments, and a World War I memorial dedicated to, against national trend, only 3 sons of the village who died in those tragic years in Europe. The renovation plans were quite ambitious, and the potential revenue for us was vital, as moths were making homes in our coffers. There was to be an entire rewiring of the church, a new array of chandelier-mounted infrared heaters, a new toilet section and kitchen, and an upgraded sound system. Once the main structural work had been completed, there would be a complete restoration of the pipe organ, which was to be repositioned on a new mezzanine floor, restored from the existing original 19th century gallery. As far as the exterior went, the concrete rendering that unsubtly hid the original masonry was to be surveyed, and where necessary, mortar joints would be repointed or carefully cleaned. I chatted to Derek about the approach as we stood in the centre of the nave, staring up at the dark rafters. Derek is a gentleman, quite spiritual in his own way, and would often start jobs by feeling the ambience in a location. He seemed quite struck by All Saints, as I remember. He mentioned I ought to keep a little eye on Jack, who had been largely silent on his return to work. Perhaps he was growing up and just wanted to get his head down and focus on his trade for a while. He seemed okay to me, hefting equipment about and connecting a kerosene generator as we prepared to get started. Hannah set herself up on a table in a corner of the nave, bringing a folder of plans out of her briefcase, as well as a selection of ancient-looking books, probably pertaining to church history, in case we needed to refer to anything. As always, basic setup was the priority on day 1. We brought some tools through and erected a safety fence on the site to block any curious passers-by. The area was now a hard hat zone, and work began that afternoon on removing some of the trim and panelling. 3. Renovation begins. The way the work proceeded is becoming clearer to me now, although I still can't remember if we managed to finish or not. It'll come, I'm sure. I do recall that we clicked through the schedule fairly normally. As with many of these old buildings, there were an assortment of additions and adjustments in the interior, some of which had to be pulled out in order to complete the structural basics needed that form the basis of the renovation. There was a minor wall in the north transept, or a short arm of the cross, if you look down on a 2-dimensional church floor plan that came away easily, and revealed a selection of old chairs and basic wooden musical instruments. These were probably used for Sunday school at some point last century. Derek made a find of greater interest behind the altar, where he noticed markedly different pointing coming away from the exterior wall spanning the width of the apse. Jack came over and expressed particular eagerness to explore that wall, saying that it didn't quite marry up with the exterior dimensions, so had to contain further space. Although about 10 feet in height, we noted it wasn't load-bearing, and to confirm this, I stood on a tall ladder in the nave and could see that a flat, wooden, quasi-mezzanine section bridged the space between that wall and the far eastern end of the church. There appeared to be no access to this upper level, and nothing was stored on it. Hannah checked over the plans and stated that despite that section not being in the work's scope, she was keen to have it assessed. I puffed my cheeks a little at the extra effort this would take, particularly if it was decided to knock the whole thing through, but as the budget could encompass some wriggle room, decided it would be worth it. Jack and Derek did knock tests and ran magnets and a cable detector across the wall's face. It certainly wasn't plasterboard, but neither was it a typical stud wall, being apparently solid brick across the entire breadth and height. It was built to stand. As the day grew dim, we turned on some LED floodlights and fired up a couple of kerosene heaters to ward off the November chill. Breaking the back of initial prep on day one was a big win, so I was eager to get through as much as possible. We left Hannah poring over some of her books as the first day came to a close. She seemed intense and distracted, but looked up long enough to say good night. 4. The Second Church. I recall nothing of that evening. It's a blank. The next thing I remember is arriving the following day. Again, a sore right shoulder. Perhaps I'm getting a bit old for this kind of work. Nothing paracetamol wouldn't fix. We found Hannah already inside the church, in the same position we'd left her in. She looked tired, and if it wasn't so ludicrous, I'd have thought she'd stayed looking at her books and notes all night. She said that she'd been on her phone to the diocese, and had gained permission to knock through the wall behind the altar. This adjusted our schedule somewhat, but if we were going to do it, it was best that we started on that straight after lunch, after completing some partly finished tasks from the previous day. Derek and Jack laid out some dust covers and started with small hammers and a pry bar. I recall Hannah pulling me to one side as the sound of metal on stone echoed around the old building. She had concerns about what was behind the wall, with the possibility of architecturally interesting features or valuable artifacts being discovered. We determined that an initial exploratory hole just large enough to look through would be the way to go. After 2 hours' careful removal of a portion of the brickwork, I could shine a torch through. Motes of brick dust swirled in the beam, as a space about 10 feet deep and apparently spanning the width of the apse was revealed. There was no other light source. This cavity had been in darkness for decades. From what I could see, it was bare of any contents, although there appeared to be a wooden square on the floor. After 1 more hour's careful dismantling of a wider section, enlarging the hole, I, Derek, and Hannah were able to don ventilator masks and climb through into the space. Jack stayed outside for safety backup, in case we came across any issues blocking our egress. Inside, the torches swept the space, as musty air reached our lungs through the filters. We could now see all of this unusual room. At the north side, to our left after entering, there was a small pile of bric-a-brac stacked. A couple of paintings, some hassocks, and a rotten box containing spoiled vestry garments and other altar linens. Perhaps this had once been a sacristy area, where priests prepared themselves for service. Our attention turned to the wooden floor section, which was topped with an iron ring. On closer inspection, it was clearly a trapdoor. A bit of firm but careful work with a pry bar released the opening up on its hinge, which complained with the stiffness of many years as it rose and swung over onto the opposite side of the joint. Stone steps led down into the darkness. Something awful was here, I think. Something down there. Damn, it's still so hazy, but this is horrendously triggering somehow.
I can feel my hesitation, and am acutely aware of my aching shoulder. I don't really want to think about this anymore. I have to. If I don't, I'm just stuck in the dark here. Wherever here is. Hannah was eager to descend the steps. She was the client and had the right gear on, so I said I would go down to check the space with her. Derek stayed up in the room to sort through the objects and measure the space. I went first, my bright torch picking out the downward flagstones as stale air rose from below. The descent was a sequence of about 12 steps. At the bottom, a short corridor with a rounded ceiling turned right, heading under the altar overhead and ending after a few yards at a door. There were 3 iron brackets in the walls on either side of the passageway, perhaps sconces for torches or fixtures for lanterns at some point. The old wooden door was arched, but fairly basic, lightly studded with a black iron handle and plated keyhole. A knock revealed it was of some thickness, the surface dry to the touch and apparently free of any groundwater dampness. I tried the handle, but the lock stood fast. I turned to Hannah and was about to suggest we return above ground to contact a locksmith and her superiors, but at this point she moved past me and produced a large old key I hadn't noticed. It slid into the lock and turned. I didn't shine the torch directly into her face, but swung the beam close enough to see her expression. It was of nervous excitement. She had expected this. The door swung inwards, and into what I could only describe as a small chapel. There were no obvious trappings of Christianity here, but at the end of the small room, only 20 feet squared, was undoubtedly an altar, rudimentary but scored with parallel lines in a style of etching I had never seen before. Atop it was a small ceramic or porcelain figurine of a many-legged animal, perhaps a sheep or goat, with what appeared to be a marble base. It was clear we had not been told the complete story, but even so I was speechless as she walked forward and lowered to her knees in front of it. "The Magna Mater," she said, before continuing murmuring in a language I did not know. She then reached out and pushed a few sections of the altar in sequence, with a small drawer emerging at the end of the last press. Reaching inside, she withdrew a silvery metal tube, possibly made of aluminium is the closest I can guess. She unstoppered one end of it and withdrew a scroll, shining her torch on it. It was written in a faded grey script on a bluish parchment. At that point, we heard a loud bang, originating from upstairs but echoing down the corridor outside. Then a short, awful scream. Hannah froze and looked up, wild-eyed and terror-stricken. I ran to the door to see a flaming, flailing figure totter, thrashing down the steps at the end. I shone the flashlight at him. Advancing towards our door, he was a blazing torch from the waist up, and as the beam lowered down, I recognized Derek's work overalls and boots. I tried to move closer, but the heat was too intense. He slumped to his knees without making a sound as smoke billowed up into the headspace, before collapsing face first, writhing to the flagstones. I recoiled in horror back into the small chapel. From above, a low howl sounded. I started to go into the corridor and past the smouldering body, but Hannah grabbed my arm and hissed for me to stay still. 5. Trapped. I demanded that Hannah tell me what was going on. Clearly she had known, or at least suspected, that we would find this place. What was it? What was the object she now held? And what the hell was that noise above in the church? She implored me to keep quiet, and moved to close the door to, but not entirely shut, enough to see along the corridor to the steps. I can recall what she then told me. "This place has been sealed for nearly 100 years, she said, eyes fixed on the door. "Yes, I'm employed by the church, but I'm also in an older order.
We used to be centered around the old Exham Priory site, which before that was a shrine to Cybele and the Magna Mater. She pointed her torch at the figure on the altar. The All-Mother with 1,000 young. This, she held up the tube with the scroll, was created by my order eons ago, almost at the start of humankind. We had hoped it still existed, that it had been brought here. All the clues pointed to this site. It's why we blocked so many attempts to work on All Saints until I was ready, with the key we knew was somewhere in the old Priory caves. "This is completely crazy," I hissed furiously. "Why on earth weren't we told about this?" Among my books upstairs, I have an incomplete copy of what we call the Black Book, written by a man called von Janst, a German, over 150 years ago. It tells of scrolls created by priests of the Magna Mater. This may look like a piece of paper, but in fact it's probably the most important weapon we could have against a great evil that has been dormant for hundreds of thousands of years, but may awake at any time. I know how this sounds, completely mad, but you have to trust me. Mad, yes. I sat down heavily. I don't know about any of this. I'm just here to do a job. There may be a fire upstairs, so we need to get out of here. The other work team won't be here until the morning. If this section or the main roof collapses, we could be buried or suffocated before they do. I can't hear my son. He's up there, and I need to know he's safe. I need to think, she said. That didn't sound human upstairs. It may be too late for your son already. She held up the tube. Others will be looking for this. She turned and knelt before the altar, apparently in meditation or even attempted communion with whatever that thing was she was on her knees before. I could not wait for an answer to come from all this nonsense. I'm a practical man, and this was time to move. I opened the door to the sound of Hannah's protest and proceeded cautiously down the corridor. My torch beam swept across my dead friend as I passed, his body still smouldering. The stench of kerosene mixed with the putrid, tanned odor of charred skin and hair filled the space, making me gag. The trapdoor was still open, the darkness of the cavity above more solid, since the day must have turned to dusk. As I climbed and my head reached the level of the upper floor, I saw an LED light appeared to be on in the nave, which was otherwise silent. My fear for Jack grew. "I have to get this to my car," whispered Hannah behind me. "This is too important." I held back my anger about her apparent disregard for Derek's death and finished ascending the steps. 6. Gatanathoa. We both stood in the concealed space. The torch revealed 2 discarded kerosene cans strewn on the floor. "Be careful," said Hannah, low. "We don't know what's up here." Surely she meant who? "Jack," I hissed. "I'm okay, Dad. Come out," called his calm, familiar voice. My relief was palpable. I clambered back out through the access hole and turned to help Hannah through. The single LED shone brightly up toward the ceiling. I could just make out Jack, behind the beam and off to the side, seated at a back pew near the main door. His parka hood was up and rolled forward into a tube, so I couldn't make out his face. "Are you okay?" I called. "Derek." "Yes, I'm fine. Derek had an accident. It was awful." Jack wasn't prone to great spikes of emotion, but even so, his voice was unusually flat for such a statement. "I don't think that's Jack," said Hannah. "Of course it is," replied Jack, who couldn't possibly have heard her from the distance he sat at. We looked at the church door, the only exit that was open to us, as the others were chained for security. Hannah edged down the aisle. Jack turned his hooded head to the side and tracked her as she walked, face pointed down towards her feet. As she drew level with him, about 10 feet from the exit. He slid in one fluid motion to stand by her and reached up, gripping her by the neck. Impossibly, he lifted her up, straight-armed, so that her feet dangled a foot off the ground. Her startled cry was muffled by the pressure on her throat. Still, his attention seemed fixed on the floor. "I'll take that, thank you." He reached out with his other hand and wrenched the metal tube from her grasp. With a flick of his wrist and a sickening click, he snapped her neck. He threw her to the ground by the door, where she sprawled lifeless, like a marionette with snipped strings. He turned and walked towards me. I can feel the terror I felt then again now. It was utterly paralyzing. He stood before me, broad-shouldered and swaying slightly, parka hood angled down, so still I had no view of his face. "I'm sorry, Jack's dad," he said, still in monotone. What are you? Where is my son?" "Your son's body is before you. Your son's soul, if you believe in such things, is at the bottom of the Narragansett Bay. We don't see many down in the dark there, but he conveniently visited us." His voice seemed to resonate, coming as much from inside my head as from his hooded face. I don't understand." "We have a device in those waters, placed by a helpful fellow a long time ago. It allows communication with our planet, like a relay. We were able to pass that signal back to one of your great seas, where I suppose you can say, where I sleep. This body is just an avatar capable of speaking your language. It's a dream to me, but it lays the ground for my approaching ascension, which will be soon. This," he raised the metal tube, "would not have been helpful." "Give me back my son," I cried. It was nearly a minute before he spoke again. "I'm sorry, that's not possible. I can no longer maintain his appearance, and will soon dispose of this body. You will be the first for many years to know my face. Now, gaze into a fraction of the aspect of Gatanathoa. An endless living death is your reward. You will relive this time, in this place here, until the end of time itself." With that, he lifted his head, and I stared through the tunnel of his hood, where I glimpsed, I struggled to describe it, an eternal pit, an infinite abyss. Deep in there writhed tentacles and a score of squid-like eyes, a kind of plasticky, scaled, wrinkled morass, shifting and utterly evil. My heart hammered, and my back braced as a kind of stultifying paralysis gripped my limbs. It felt like a heart attack, even a whole-body attack, a petrifying lamination of terror blasting me through my spine with the shock of 1,000 suns, 1,000 earthquakes. And now, just that pressure on my right shoulder, an infernal, pressing pressure. God in heaven, where are you? 7. The hospital. Alice continued gripping Gordon's right shoulder as the sedative was administered. Gordon's low, terrible wailing subsided as Dr. Portman watched readings stabilize on his bedside machine. Midazolam mixed with fentanyl appears to solve some of the discomfort, he said as Alice released her pressure. "I'm sorry. We're no closer to working out what this is. We have some experts coming across from the US next week. They're aware of some similar cases in Boston many years ago. Although no one is still alive who dealt with them, they have some records." "He's so cold," said Alice, running her hand along his cheek, above which Gordon Hugh's eyes remained closed. He had been here for 3 weeks, and she felt like she was in an unending nightmare. "You still have no idea about the skin condition or the cause?" "I'm sorry, we've just not seen it before. It's like a kind of petrified leather effect. Our theory,
and advice taken from the people at Porton Down is that it wasn't a human-made agent that caused this, or a virus. We can't see any traces of viral activity in the bloods we've taken, which was difficult given the condition of the epidermis. Perhaps it was a dormant airborne toxin that was behind that opened space in the church. We're so sorry to not have any more information. No news on your son? No, they've not found him yet. Alice's face was etched with worry. One thing, said Dr. Portman. We've noticed his mental activity seems to loop in 2-day cycles. The first 24 to 36 hours seem fairly calm, although we have evidence of what I can only call REM activity behind the eyelids, before the screaming starts, interjected Alice. Dr. Portman maintained a smooth tone. Well, before he becomes agitated. It's like he's repeatedly dreaming something, although we can't tell what, of course. We'll get to the bottom of this, Mrs. Hughes. Some of the best specialists in Europe have become aware of this case, and there is a group video call next week. For now, he seems stable, but in a suspended state. The drip we've forced into his arm appears to be delivering the needed nutrients. For now, we'll keep him monitored and isolated in this room until we understand what to do. He stood and left, shaking his head again at the 2 detectives outside the room who were eager to discuss the corpses located when the additional work team arrived at the church. As with every other day, Alice stayed with Gordon until visiting hours ended. Then she drove home to a house way too empty, but at least far enough from neighbors not to disturb them with her tears. Back at the hospital, in a darkened private room, Gordon's eyes relaxed their wild thrashing behind their lids. They stayed fixed on something for an hour, then began roving gently again. 8. A grey morning. I need to think. It was a grey morning. We pulled into All Saints' Church at Anchester just after dawn. I recall this particular renovation wasn't straightforward, but my memories have been hazy since we finished, so I'll just think it through and the details should become clear. If you enjoyed listening today, be sure to subscribe to the channel by hitting the red subscribe button below. After doing so, click the bell icon next to the subscribe button to receive new content notifications. If you'd like to support our work and receive exclusive perks, consider becoming a channel member by clicking the join button below. To support us in other ways, see the video description for links to our Bandcamp and Patreon pages, our merch store over at Teespring, and further information relating to our releases on Audible, iTunes, and Spotify. And until next time.